History feels solid, dates carved in stone, names etched into textbooks. But what if some of the moments we trust most were carefully staged illusions? Tonight, we're peeling back the varnish on the past, where forged documents breathe, vanished witnesses whisper, and entire civilizations are reframed by a single lie. Why do certain artifacts appear at the perfect time? Who benefits when a story survives, and who is erased when it doesn't? Over the next 3 hours, we'll trace the cracks. Quiet, unsettling, undeniable. So sit back, steady your breath, and let's step into the shadows where history bends. The morning light settles over Antietam Creek like a thin veil, drifting across fields that appear almost peaceful now. Grass bends in the wind. Stone bridges hold their shape. Yet, beneath the soil lie fragments of iron, fabric, and bone, silent evidence of a conflict that still refuses to stay buried. The American Civil War is often introduced with a single, definitive explanation. But history, when examined closely, rarely conforms to one cause alone. In classrooms and public memory, the war is most commonly framed as a moral struggle over slavery, and with good reason. Slavery was real, brutal, and deeply embedded in the Southern economy and social order. Its defense shaped political speeches, legal structures, and the lives of millions. Yet when historians sift through letters, economic records, legislative debates, and military orders, a more complex picture begins to emerge. One in which slavery is central, but not solitary. The United States of the mid-19th century was a nation under strain. Industrial cities in the North were expanding rapidly, fueled by railroads, factories, and immigrant labor. The South, largely agrarian, relied on plantation economics tied to global trade. These two systems did not merely coexist, they competed. Tariffs designed to protect northern industry were seen in the South as punitive. Federal authority, once distant, now felt intrusive. The question that simmered beneath the surface was not only about human bondage, but about power, who held it and who would lose it. Walk through the archives and the language becomes revealing. Southern leaders spoke of states' rights, often without immediate reference to slavery. Northern politicians warned of a fractured union, of economic collapse, of rival nations exploiting internal weakness. Was slavery the cause, or the catalyst that ignited a powder keg already packed with resentment, fear, and ambition? Some documents complicate the story further. Early in the war, Union generals returned escaped enslaved people to their owners. President Lincoln himself stated, at least publicly, that preserving the Union took precedence over abolition. The Emancipation Proclamation did not arrive until nearly 2 years into the fighting, and even then, it applied only to territories in rebellion. Why, some ask, would a war supposedly fought primarily over slavery hesitate so long to confront it directly? This is where the mystery deepens. Economic historians point to the collapse of compromise after decades of uneasy balance. Political scholars note the breakdown of constitutional trust between regions. Others look at expansion westward, new territories, new markets, new votes, and the question of who would control them. In this view, slavery becomes one element in a larger struggle over the future shape of the nation. More speculative theories drift at the edges of accepted scholarship. Some suggest the war was inevitable, engineered by financial interests that profited from Reconstruction and industrial militarization. Others propose that cultural divergence between North and South had reached a point where separation, peaceful or not, was unavoidable. These ideas remain debated, contested, and often criticized, but they persist, resurfacing whenever new evidence or interpretations emerge. What remains undeniable is that the war's participants did not all fight for the same reasons. A factory worker in Pennsylvania, a farmer in Georgia, an enslaved man fleeing a plantation, and a politician in Washington each carried different motivations into the conflict. Letters from soldiers rarely speak in abstract moral terms. They mention land, loyalty, fear, honor, survival. History, it seems, is not driven by a single voice, but by a chorus, often discordant, sometimes contradictory. Standing at Antietam, or Gettysburg, or Shiloh, the question lingers in the quiet. Can a war be mainly about anything, when its causes are layered, human, and unresolved even by those who lived through it? Or does the need for a simple explanation say more about the present than the past? The ground does not answer. It only waits, holding what it knows, as history continues to invite us back, asking what else we might have missed. The unanswered questions linger in the air, much like they did on those Civil War fields. Questions without markers, without final agreement. And from that uncertainty, a broader idea quietly emerges, one that stretches far beyond any single war or nation. Deep inside a climate-controlled archive, a single manuscript rests under glass. Its ink has browned with age, its margins crowded with careful edits made centuries ago. This version survived. Others did not. Historians often describe such documents as windows into the past, but glass reflects as much as it reveals. What we see depends on where we stand, and who was allowed to leave their mark. The phrase is familiar. History is written by the victors. It appears in textbooks, lectures, and conversations, usually as a warning rather than a rule. Mainstream historians are quick to clarify that history is shaped by evidence, not simply by triumph. And yet, when we trace which voices echo through time, a pattern begins to surface. Empires fall, but their records remain. Defeated cultures fade, leaving fragments, ruins, and second-hand descriptions, often penned by those who conquered them. Ancient Rome provides a striking example. Much of what we know about its enemies, the Gauls, the Carthaginians, the early Germanic tribes, comes from Roman writers. Their words are vivid, detailed, and unapologetically biased. They describe barbarians at the gates, moral decay beyond the frontier, enemies who justified conquest by their very existence. But where are the opposing accounts? Were they never written or simply never preserved? Mainstream explanations point to literacy, materials, and infrastructure. Rome had scribes, archives, and stone. Its rivals often relied on oral tradition or perishable texts. When cities burned, their stories burned with them. This explanation is logical, measurable, and supported by archaeology. Yet it does not fully quiet the unease. If survival determines truth, then how much of history is accidental? How many narratives vanished, not because they were false, but because they were fragile? Move forward in time, and the pattern repeats. Medieval chronicles describe peasant revolts as chaos, heresy, or criminal madness. The rebels themselves left little behind. Colonial records detail exploration, discovery, and administration, while indigenous perspectives surface only in fragments, filtered through translators, missionaries, or later reconstructions. The dominant story moves forward, polished and bound, while alternative versions remain footnotes if they appear at all. Some scholars argue that this imbalance is narrowing. Modern archaeology, linguistics, and forensic science recover voices once thought lost. Mass graves challenge official casualty numbers. Deciphered scripts reshape timelines. Even so, gaps remain. Silence, after all, cannot be excavated so easily. At the edges of academic discussion, more speculative ideas take shape. Some suggest that history is not merely recorded by victors, but actively curated, edited to legitimize power, suppress dissent, or create continuity where none existed. They point to sudden dynastic origin stories, rewritten genealogies, and conveniently missing decades in royal records. Others wonder whether entire civilizations have been reduced to myth because acknowledging them would disrupt established timelines. These theories are contested and often criticized, yet they persist. Perhaps because they touch a deeper question, not whether history can be trusted, but whether it can ever be complete. Even modern conflicts demonstrate how quickly narratives diverge. The same event can be described as liberation or invasion, defense or aggression, depending on who holds the pen. Official reports solidify within years, sometimes months, while first-hand experiences fade as witnesses age or disappear. When archives open decades later, they rarely overturn the story entirely, but they do complicate it. Consider the role of absence. When a group leaves no written record, historians rely on what others said about them. But description is not the same as understanding. Motives are inferred. Beliefs are summarized. Humanity is compressed into categories that fit the storyteller's needs. Over time, repetition grants authority, and authority hardens into fact. Standing before that manuscript in the archive, one cannot help but wonder how many other versions once existed. How many were deemed unnecessary, dangerous, or simply inconvenient? How many truths required defeat to be forgotten? History may not belong solely to the victors, but victory determines which stories are easiest to hear. And as we continue this exploration, the question remains quietly unresolved. When we look backward, are we seeing the past as it was, or only as it survived? The question of whose story survives still hangs in the air when the setting shifts, away from archives and battlefields toward a small New England town where the past feels closer to the surface. In Salem, Massachusetts, the ground is uneven, the streets narrow, the buildings darkened by centuries of salt air and winter storms. A simple wooden meeting house once stood at the center of it all. No grand monument marked the beginning, only whispered fears, unsettled nights, and a community listening too closely to its own dread. The Salem witch trials are often remembered as a brief outbreak of superstition, a moment when people truly believed the devil walked among them. The popular image is vivid: accused witches, spectral visions, black magic, and firelit interrogations. And on the surface, the records seem to support this. Court transcripts are filled with references to curses, familiars, and invisible assaults. Ministers preached of Satan's presence. Children screamed and convulsed. To many at the time, witchcraft was not metaphor, it was explanation. Yet, when historians slow the story down, something begins to shift. The trials unfolded in 1692 in a colony already strained by hardship. Massachusetts was emerging from years of war, disease, and political uncertainty. Entire villages had been displaced by frontier conflicts. Crops failed. Families were divided along lines of wealth, land ownership, and religious authority. Salem itself was fractured between town and village, merchant and farmer, old families and new arrivals. Tension was not an exception, it was the atmosphere. Mainstream scholarship suggests that witchcraft accusations provided a language for conflict that could not otherwise be spoken. Grievances over property, inheritance, and reputation found expression through supernatural claims. When evidence was scarce and fear abundant, suspicion became contagious. Accusations multiplied, and once named guilt was difficult to escape. Confession sometimes spared a life. Denial often sealed a fate. But even this explanation feels incomplete. Why here? Why then? Other colonies shared similar beliefs and hardships, yet none erupted with the same intensity. Salem's trials were swift, legalistic, and deadly. 19 people were executed. 1 was pressed to death. Many more were imprisoned. The machinery of justice moved with an urgency that seems, even now, unsettling. Some researchers point to psychological explanations. The afflicted girls displayed symptoms that modern observers have compared to hysteria, trauma, or stress-induced illness. Others have proposed environmental causes, including ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus that can grow on rye and produce convulsions, paranoia, and vivid visions. The theory is debated, neither proven nor dismissed, lingering in the margins of the historical record. There are also questions about authority. The colonial government was in transition, its charter recently revoked and replaced. Courts were newly formed, eager to establish legitimacy. Ministers held immense influence, but even they disagreed on how far spectral evidence should be trusted. In this uncertainty, rigid belief may have offered clarity, rules where none existed, enemies where anxiety needed shape. Still, the language of witchcraft remains striking. The accused described encounters with figures that sounded eerily similar, as if drawn from a shared script. Was this the result of leading questions, cultural expectation, or something else entirely? A collective imagination shaped by sermons, folklore, and fear, producing experiences that felt real to those who lived them? At the fringes of interpretation, more speculative ideas emerge. Some suggest the trials masked deliberate social cleansing, an attempt to remove inconvenient individuals, particularly outspoken women or those who challenged local hierarchies. Others wonder whether knowledge outside accepted religious doctrine, folk medicine, midwifery, inherited traditions, was perceived as threatening in a society obsessed with spiritual purity. These ideas are not easily proven, but they persist because they align with broader patterns seen elsewhere and elsewhen. Even the end of the trials raises questions. The accusations stopped almost as suddenly as they began. Public doubt grew. Influential figures withdrew support. Apologies were issued years later. Compensation paid decades after that. The colony moved on, but without a single satisfying explanation. No confession unraveled the mystery. No document revealed a hidden plan. Walking through Salem today, the past feels curated. Memorials, plaques, preserved homes. Yet beneath the structure lies uncertainty. The official record tells us who was accused, who testified, who died. It does not tell us precisely why belief overwhelmed restraint, or why reason failed when it was needed most. Were the Salem witch trials truly about witchcraft? Or was witchcraft the language used to express something deeper? Fear of change, fear of loss, fear of one another. And if belief itself can become evidence, how many other moments in history might be hiding behind the same veil? The answers remain elusive. The silence between the documents still speaks. And as the story continues, the question lingers quietly in the background. What else have we misunderstood simply because we accepted the explanation that survived? The uncertainty left behind in Salem does not fade. It follows us, stretching further back in time into eras where stone outlasted memory and empires believed themselves eternal. From whispered accusations in wooden halls, the story drifts now toward marble columns and broken roads, toward a civilization whose shadow still shapes the modern world. At dawn, the Roman Forum is quiet. Columns rise like ribs from the earth, fractured yet deliberate. Moss settles into cracks worn by centuries of footsteps. What was once the administrative heart of an empire now stands open to the sky, its silence broken only by wind and distant traffic. It is tempting to imagine a single moment when everything fell apart. One final invasion, one last emperor, one decisive end. But the stones offer no such clarity. The popular narrative is simple and dramatic. The Roman Empire collapsed suddenly, overwhelmed by barbarian invasions, its greatness extinguished almost overnight. Textbooks often mark a date, a D 476, when the last Western emperor was deposed. A line is drawn, history neatly divided into before and after. Yet when historians examine the evidence, that clean ending begins to blur. For centuries before that symbolic moment, Rome had been changing. Its borders stretched vast and uneven, difficult to defend. The empire was divided administratively, split between East and West in an attempt to survive its own scale. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Civil wars were frequent. Coinage was debased. Tax systems strained. None of this resembled a sudden collapse. It looked more like erosion. Contemporary Roman writers sensed this unease. They spoke of decline, of lost virtue, of a fading moral core. Some blamed luxury, others corruption, others the abandonment of traditional gods. Still, daily life continued. Cities bustled, trade flowed, laws were enforced. For many citizens, Rome did not feel as though it was ending at all. Even the so-called barbarian invasions appear less straightforward under scrutiny. Many groups that crossed into Roman territory were not outsiders in the modern sense. They had traded with Rome, served in its armies, adopted its customs. Some were invited in as allies or settlers. The line between Roman and non-Roman had already grown porous. When authority shifted, it often did so quietly. Administrators replaced by local rulers, taxes collected under new names. Archaeology reinforces this slow transformation. In some regions, villas were abandoned. In others, they were repurposed. Roads fell into disrepair in one province and remained in use in another. Coin circulation declined unevenly. There is no universal layer of destruction marking a single catastrophic end. Instead, the material record suggests regional change, adaptation, and survival. And then there is the Eastern Empire. While the West fragmented, the eastern half endured for nearly 1,000 more years. Its capital thrived, its bureaucracy functioned, its armies held. If Rome fell in one sudden collapse, why did it continue elsewhere, speaking the same language of law and power, calling itself Roman long after the West was gone? This question opens the door to deeper uncertainty. Was the fall of Rome an event, or a story constructed later to make sense of gradual change? Medieval chroniclers, writing long after the empire's transformation, may have needed a clear ending to frame their own beginnings. Renaissance thinkers, looking back, framed Rome's decline as a cautionary tale. Each retelling sharpened the drama. At the fringes of academic debate, more speculative ideas surface. Some propose that Rome never truly fell at all, but simply evolved. Its institutions absorbed into emerging kingdoms, its influence diffused rather than destroyed. Others point to climatic shifts, plagues, and environmental stressors, suggesting forces largely invisible to those living through them. A few wonder whether our modern desire for collapse narratives says more about us than about Rome. Even the date AD 476 loses its certainty. To the people alive at the time, it passed with little fanfare. No empire-wide announcement declared the end. No universal sense of finality followed. Life went on, altered but continuous. Farmers planted crops. Bishops wrote letters. Soldiers pledged loyalty to new leaders who still wore Roman titles. Standing in the Forum today, surrounded by remnants of power that once claimed the known world, the idea of a sudden collapse feels almost misleading. Empires, like beliefs, do not vanish in a moment. They thin, shift, fracture, and linger. Their endings are rarely clear to those inside them, so the question remains unresolved. Did the Roman Empire fall, or did it simply change its shape, leaving us to mistake transformation for ruin? And if one of history's greatest powers did not end as abruptly as we are told, how many other collapses might still be waiting to be reconsidered? From the crumbling stones of Rome, the story does not end. It moves east, carried by dust and distance, toward landscapes where history was not built in marble, but written across open grasslands. The slow transformation of empires gives way to a different kind of power, one that moved with the horizon itself. At dawn on the Mongolian steppe, the land appears endless. Grass ripples like water under the wind. There are no walls here, no ruins rising from the earth, only sky, motion, and silence. Somewhere beneath this vast openness, a man once stood whose name would echo across continents: Genghis Khan. To many, he is remembered simply as a destroyer, a force of violence unleashed upon the world. Cities burned, populations vanished, entire regions were reshaped by conquest. The image is stark, and it endures. But as with Rome, the closer one looks, the less singular the story becomes. Mainstream history does not deny the devastation. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century were among the most lethal in human history. Contemporary accounts describe mass killings, scorched cities, and psychological warfare designed to break resistance before battle even began. Chroniclers wrote of rivers clogged with bodies and landscapes emptied of life. These records form the foundation of Genghis Khan's reputation, and they are not easily dismissed. Yet many of those accounts come from the conquered. Persian scholars, Chinese officials, European envoys, each writing from the perspective of loss. Their words are powerful, but also shaped by trauma, fear, and political purpose. As with earlier empires, the surviving narratives carry the weight of those who endured defeat. When Mongol sources are examined, sparse, fragmented, and often reconstructed later, a different image begins to surface. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, emerged from a world of constant tribal conflict, betrayal, and survival. The steppe was not peaceful before his rise. It was already violent, governed by shifting alliances and cycles of revenge. His early life was marked by abandonment, enslavement, and the collapse of his family's status. Power in this context was not inherited. It was seized or lost. What distinguished Genghis Khan was not only conquest but organization. He broke traditional tribal hierarchies, promoting loyalty over lineage. He established legal codes that applied across cultures. He protected religious practices, allowing Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and shamanism to coexist within his realm. Merchants were safeguarded. Messengers could cross thousands of miles under imperial protection. Trade routes once fractured by conflict became connected under Mongol rule. This does not erase the violence, but it complicates it. Archaeological and economic evidence suggests that the Mongol Empire facilitated unprecedented exchange. Technologies, ideas, and goods moved rapidly across Eurasia. Paper, gunpowder, medical knowledge, and navigation techniques traveled along routes stabilized by Mongol authority. Some historians argue that this interconnectedness helped lay the groundwork for the modern world, even as it was born from conquest. Still, questions remain. Was this order intentional or merely a byproduct of expansion? Did Genghis Khan envision a unified world, or was unity simply the most efficient way to maintain control? The sources are silent on motive. The man himself left no autobiography, no personal philosophy written in his own hand. At the edges of scholarship, more speculative interpretations emerge. Some suggest that Mongol violence was exaggerated by later empires eager to portray themselves as civilized successors to chaos. Others propose that population losses attributed to slaughter may also reflect disease, famine, and displacement amplified by war. A few even question whether the sheer scale of destruction has been mythologized over time, growing larger with each retelling. Yet there are also mysteries that resist explanation. Genghis Khan's burial place remains unknown, deliberately hidden according to legend. No tomb, no marker. An empire-spanning conqueror erased his final location from history. Was this an act of humility, superstition, or control over his own legacy? Or does the absence itself feed the myth, allowing each generation to project its fears and fascinations onto him? As with Rome's fall, the label we assign, savage destroyer, may reflect our need for simplicity. It is easier to contain a figure within a single moral frame than to confront contradiction. A man can be both ruthless and visionary. An empire can bring devastation and connection at the same time. History does not always separate these roles cleanly. Standing on the step, where no walls ever fell and no capitals burned into ruin, the question lingers quietly. Was Genghis Khan merely a force of destruction? Or was he something more complex, shaped by his world and reshaping it in return? And if his legacy still defies clear definition, how many other figures have we reduced to symbols, simply because the truth was harder to hold? The wind stirs the soil at Hisarlik, a place that today seems quiet, even desolate. It sits on the edge of the Aegean, where the sea stretches endlessly beneath a sky that shifts with the seasons. But beneath this unassuming hill, beneath the earth that feels so familiar, lies a layer of ancient mystery. It is here that, according to legend, Troy once stood, its walls rising with strength, its people proud and defiant, until the Greeks brought it to ruin. The story of Troy has been told countless times, through epic poetry, through art, through the myths that formed the foundation of Western civilization. And in that story, there is one image that endures above all others: the Trojan horse. The colossal wooden beast, said to be filled with Greek soldiers, left outside the gates of Troy as a gift, a token of peace. The Trojans, believing they had won, brought it into their city. But inside, hidden away, waited the Greek army, who would emerge in the dead of night and destroy Troy from within. It is an image so deeply ingrained in culture that we hardly question its authenticity. But what if the Trojan horse was not the turning point of history, but simply a turning point of storytelling? What if it was never real at all? The epic poem The Aeneid by the Roman poet Virgil is among the most famous sources to describe the horse. Written hundreds of years after the supposed fall of Troy, it paints a vivid cinematic picture of Greeks emerging from the wooden beast. Yet, when historians sift through the physical evidence at Hisarlik, the site of ancient Troy, they find no trace of a structure, no remnants of an enormous wooden horse, no telltale signs of the kind of large-scale siege warfare described in the legend. Instead, the archaeological record tells a different story. The city of Troy was indeed destroyed several times, but the dates and methods of destruction do not align with the precise narrative we have inherited. Troy's final fall, around the 12th century BC, occurred long before the tales of the Trojan horse were written. While evidence of a burning city exists, there is no definitive proof of a trick like the one depicted in Homer's Iliad or Virgil's Aeneid. The walls of Troy did not collapse under the weight of an enormous wooden horse, but rather through the more familiar and plausible methods of siege and conflict. So, where did the story come from? Historians and scholars have long speculated that the tale of the Trojan horse may have grown out of the traditions of ancient warfare. It is not impossible to imagine that a smaller, more pragmatic siege tactic, such as a surprise attack or a clever diversion, became transformed over centuries into the grand image of a massive horse. After all, storytelling thrives on exaggeration and symbolism, especially when a culture seeks to explain its victories or defeats. Some suggest that the story of the Trojan horse may have symbolized the deceptive nature of war itself. The horse could represent the way a city might lower its guard in the face of a seemingly innocent gift, how civilizations often fall not through force but through cunning, betrayal, and the unanticipated. Such a story would resonate powerfully in a time when Greek and Roman military prowess was idolized, a story that highlights not just physical strength, but the cleverness and strategy that marked the greatest conquests. In addition, there are theories that the horse was a symbolic representation of the casus belli, the justification for the Greeks' prolonged siege of Troy. The horse itself could be a metaphor for the eventual fate of Troy, its downfall not a single night of stealth, but the culmination of years of conflict, of strained alliances, and of the inevitable nature of war. At the fringes of these academic explorations, even more intriguing ideas emerge. Some have speculated that the horse was an invention, an allegory, created by a culture whose power and influence were fading. The Greeks, writing centuries after the fact, may have imbued the story with a sense of mystery and grandeur that made their military successes seem otherworldly, even inevitable. By embedding their victory in myth, they ensured that their story would endure. But there are also those who claim the myth of the Trojan horse holds an echo of some lost truth, an ancient technique lost to time but preserved in legend. Could the horse have been a real, albeit smaller, weapon of war? Perhaps a large siege engine, a kind of mobile fortress or trap. Some suggest it may have been a ruse, a deceptive trick involving an actual structure, nothing so grand as a massive wooden beast, but perhaps a smaller version used as a psychological weapon. Still, no such discovery has been made at Hisarlik, leaving the imagination to fill in the gaps. And yet, even without physical evidence, the myth remains compelling. For how could something so widely accepted, so ingrained in culture for thousands of years, simply be the result of an overzealous imagination? The mystery persists. Is the Trojan horse a myth, or is it the remnant of a lost strategy, a symbol that lives on in the cracks of historical memory? Standing at the site of ancient Troy today, the wind sweeping across the plain, the remnants of walls half buried, one cannot help but wonder, could the truth be buried beneath the layers of myth, distorted by time? Could there have been some kind of deception, a clever maneuver that didn't involve a massive horse at all? What if the Trojan horse itself is a story so powerful that it has become the truth, even if the reality is far more complicated, far more human? The answers are elusive. The stones of Troy tell their own story, but they do not speak in the way we expect. The horse might never be found, and the legend might always hold a place in our imagination. But the mystery of how myth and reality intertwine, and how history is shaped by the stories we tell, remains ever present, just out of reach. And with every question we ask, another layer of history slips further into shadow. The air in Paris, centuries ago, was thick, not just with the smoke of revolution, but with anticipation. The streets buzzed with anger, but also with a sense of possibility. In the shadow of the gilded halls of Versailles, a city of contrast unfolded. The rich lived in opulence, while just beyond their grand gates, the poor and destitute struggled to survive. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, became the iconic symbol of this revolt, an emblem of the downtrodden rising against an oppressive regime. For many, the French Revolution is a tale of a starving, angry populace overthrowing the aristocracy, demanding justice, liberty, and equality. But, like so many historic events, the full picture is more layered, more intricate, and far more complex than the simple narrative often presented. What if the French Revolution wasn't driven by the poor alone, but by something more widespread? Something that involved the very institutions of power they sought to dismantle? When we examine the French Revolution through the lens of class struggle, it seems straightforward. Hungry peasants, starving artisans, and a disillusioned urban working class took to the streets, fueled by the injustice of a corrupt and extravagant monarchy. The cries of liberté, égalité, fraternité echoed through the streets, a rallying cry for the oppressed. But the revolution did not come from the peasantry alone. In fact, it may not have even been primarily about them. As we trace the origins of the revolution, we see a different story unfolding, a story of intellectual ferment and elite dissatisfaction. The Enlightenment, a movement that questioned traditional power structures, spread through the salons of Paris, in the writings of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. Their critique of absolute monarchy, of the divine right of kings, found eager audiences among the educated elite, the bourgeoisie, and even certain members of the aristocracy. They were not driven by hunger, but by ideas, a desire to reshape the political order itself, to reimagine France as a nation where power came from reason and the consent of the governed. Consider the pivotal figures of the Revolution: Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat. While many of them were born into modest circumstances, they had all risen through the ranks of the educated classes. Their revolutionary zeal was not fueled by direct poverty, but by a deep dissatisfaction with the monarchy's failure to reform and address the grievances of the emerging bourgeoisie. These men were philosophers and politicians, not peasants. They were intellectuals, not the starving masses they would later lead. Then, we must ask, where were the true beneficiaries of this change? While the poor were certainly part of the revolution, many of them were also caught in the crossfire of the political shifts that followed. The radical changes in land ownership and the redistribution of wealth were not designed to benefit the poorest of society directly. Instead, much of the new wealth that emerged from the fall of the monarchy flowed into the hands of the bourgeoisie, the very class that had long resented the aristocracy, but had never truly shared the plight of the peasantry. The monarchy's downfall was not merely a consequence of social inequality, but of economic crisis. France's debt, ballooning from the costs of wars, including support for the American Revolution, had left the country on the brink of financial collapse. King Louis XVI's inability to raise taxes from the nobility and the church, who were exempt, further exacerbated the crisis. When the Estates General convened in 1789 to resolve the issue, it was not just the common people, but also the wealthier bourgeoisie who felt the pressure of a broken system. As they gathered at Versailles, many of them believed that the monarchy itself had to be overthrown in order to save France, not for the benefit of the poor, but for the survival of the state. What's more, the success of the revolution was far from guaranteed to benefit the common folk. In fact, the revolution's trajectory took an increasingly radical turn as the Parisian elite, with their ties to the growing power of the National Assembly, pushed the revolution into the reign of terror. What began as a political revolution quickly became a war of ideological purity, a time when even the most radical voices were silenced by the guillotine. The sans-culottes, the lower-class revolutionaries, found themselves caught between competing factions. Revolutionary leaders like Robespierre, while fighting for equality, often clashed with the very people they had claimed to represent. At the heart of the revolution was a shift not just in social power, but in the very idea of authority itself. The revolution was as much about the redistribution of power among the elites as it was about the suffering of the poor. While the ancien regime crumbled, the elites who rose in its place weren't always interested in improving conditions for the peasantry. Napoleon Bonaparte, the eventual successor to the revolution, would go on to consolidate power for himself, creating an empire with many of the same structures that the revolution had claimed to dismantle. And so, we must ask, if the French Revolution was truly driven by the poor, why did it lead to a consolidation of power among the bourgeoisie and, later, the rise of a new autocrat? Why did the promises of liberty and equality often fail to materialize in the everyday lives of the people who had first taken to the streets? Perhaps the answer lies in the contradiction at the heart of the revolution itself. A revolution that was simultaneously about class struggle and the preservation of the existing social order. The poor were, undoubtedly, a crucial force in the revolution, but their power was always mediated by the intellectual and political elite who saw in the chaos of the revolution a chance to reshape society. The revolutionaries themselves were not immune from the temptations of power, and the result was a political upheaval that shifted power, but often failed to address the root causes of poverty or inequality. Standing in the Place de la Concorde today, where the guillotine once claimed its victims, the question remains unanswered. What really drove the French Revolution? Was it the unrelenting hunger and despair of the poor, or the intellectual forces of the bourgeoisie that gave birth to the ideas of liberty and equality? The revolution changed the face of France. But for whom, and at what cost? The answers may lie in the contradictions of the revolution itself and in the mysteries of who truly benefited from its chaos. The city of Rome today is a patchwork of ancient grandeur and modern life, but hidden within its winding streets, beneath its gleaming facades, is a dark chapter in the history of science, one that still lingers in the collective memory. In the heart of this city, in a place where history is intertwined with the present, the story of Galileo Galilei and his clash with the Catholic Church unfolds. The year is 1633, and Galileo stands in the courtroom of the Roman Catholic Inquisition. His eyes, sharp and keen, have seen things that no one before him had imagined. Jupiter's moons, the phases of Venus, the intricate details of the moon's surface. Through his telescope, he revealed a universe in motion, a cosmos far beyond the Earth's center. But the Church, bound by centuries of doctrine, had other ideas. The Earth, they insisted, was the center of the universe. And Galileo's observations, which he believed supported the theory of a heliocentric system, where the Earth and other planets revolve around the Sun, were an affront to sacred teachings. It is a narrative familiar to many. Galileo, the fearless scientist, tortured for daring to challenge the Church. His trial, the threat of the Inquisition, and the eventual forced recantation have been etched into history as a symbol of the conflict between science and religion. For centuries, this story has been told with a moral clarity that leaves little room for doubt. Galileo, the martyr for truth, against the oppressive forces of superstition and dogma. But as we move deeper into the details of his life and the circumstances surrounding his trial, the simple picture begins to unravel. It's true that Galileo was put on trial by the Catholic Church. He was found guilty of heresy for advocating the heliocentric model, and he was forced to recant his views under threat of torture. However, there is no definitive evidence that Galileo was ever physically tortured, as the story has so often claimed. In fact, the historical record is unclear on the nature of his punishment. While Galileo was forced to publicly retract his support for Copernican theory, he was not executed, nor was he imprisoned in the dungeons of the Inquisition, as some accounts suggest. Instead, he was placed under house arrest in his villa in Florence, where he continued to work and write until his death. So, if Galileo wasn't tortured in the traditional sense, why has the image of him as a martyr for scientific truth endured so strongly? The answer, perhaps, lies in the power of narrative, the story we tell ourselves about the conflict between science and religion, and how it shapes our understanding of history. Galileo's trial, though a painful and dangerous moment in his life, was not the defining moment of his scientific career. His contributions to physics, motion, and astronomy were already revolutionary by the time the trial occurred. The question remains, did the Church really stand in the way of his scientific work, or was it something more complicated? At the time of Galileo's trial, the heliocentric theory was not universally accepted even by many of Galileo's fellow scientists. The evidence for the Copernican system was still being debated, and many scientists, including some who were sympathetic to Galileo's work, were not yet convinced. The Church's opposition to the heliocentric model was not solely about the suppression of scientific progress, but about the challenge it posed to theological and philosophical beliefs that had been held for centuries. The Earth's central position in the universe was not just a scientific matter. It was deeply tied to the Church's interpretation of Scripture and its authority over the natural world. Moreover, Galileo's confrontation with the Church was not purely a matter of religious dogma versus scientific truth. It was also a deeply political issue. Galileo was a public figure, and his writings were not merely scientific treatises. They were also polemical. He had a tendency to openly mock those who disagreed with him, including the powerful Jesuit order, which was deeply embedded within the Church's hierarchy. His use of satire and invective alienated many of his potential allies, including influential figures who could have protected him from the full force of the Inquisition. Galileo's confrontational style, his public bravado, and his insistence on the truth of his discoveries without room for compromise all played a role in escalating the conflict. The Church, for its part, was not monolithic in its response to Galileo. While the Inquisition condemned his ideas, there were also scholars within the Church who supported Galileo's work. In fact, some members of the Church, such as the theologian and scientist Christopher Clavius, were sympathetic to Galileo's observations and worked to reconcile science with faith. It was not the Church as an institution that opposed Galileo's ideas, but certain factions within it, particularly those who saw the Copernican system as a direct challenge to the established order. The deeper question, then, is not whether Galileo was tortured for his beliefs, but whether the narrative of his trial has been shaped to fit our modern understanding of the relationship between science and religion. Has the story of Galileo's suffering been amplified over time, creating a mythic figure who stands as a symbol for the triumph of scientific reason over religious ignorance? Or were his challenges more about the politics of his time, the interpersonal dynamics of the scientific community, and the ways in which powerful institutions, religious and academic, respond to new ideas? Standing in the quiet, reverent halls of the Vatican, or gazing out over the Tuscan hills, where Galileo spent his final years, one cannot help but wonder. How much of the story we've inherited about Galileo is shaped by the lens of our own time? How much of his trial was a product of the religious and political landscape of the 17th century, rather than the simple clash of science against superstition? Perhaps the true mystery lies not in the question of whether Galileo was tortured, but in the larger story of how history, our history, selects its heroes and villains. The tale of Galileo, stripped of its mythic layers, remains an enigma. Was it really about the Earth's motion? Or was it about the politics of power and belief? The vast, empty expanse of the European countryside can be deceptive. Beneath the rolling hills and the quiet villages lies a history that is often overlooked, forgotten, or misunderstood. In the distance, the spires of medieval cathedrals still reach toward the sky, remnants of a time when the echoes of a lost world rang louder than the present. This is the land of the so-called Dark Ages, a period stretching from roughly the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance. It is a time often depicted as one of ignorance, superstition, and stagnation, a so-called dark time when the light of knowledge was supposedly extinguished. Yet, as we look closer, something doesn't add up. The term Dark Ages itself, often attributed to the historian Petrarch in the 14th century, carries with it an inherent assumption that this era, this long stretch of history, was a time devoid of progress, a world marked by a dramatic fall from the heights of classical civilization. It paints a picture of illiteracy, of feudalism, of a society trapped in ignorance, where the knowledge of the ancients was lost and the spark of intellectual curiosity seemed to be snuffed out. But when we step away from this narrative, a different story begins to emerge. Consider the monasteries that dotted the European landscape during this time. While we often think of the Dark Ages as a time of intellectual darkness, it is important to remember that these monasteries were not just places of religious devotion, but centers of learning. The monks who inhabited them were often among the few literate members of society. In the scriptoriums of these secluded communities, ancient texts were copied and preserved, classical works of Greek and Roman philosophy, science, and literature that might otherwise have been lost to time. They also studied and expanded upon the knowledge of the day: astronomy, medicine, architecture, and mathematics, often blending the ancient with the new. Take the work of Alcuin of York, a scholar who became an advisor to Charlemagne in the 8th century. Alcuin helped establish the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning and culture in the midst of an otherwise fractured Europe. Under Charlemagne's patronage, a system of education was established that spanned much of the continent. Manuscripts were copied, schools were set up, and the foundations for intellectual revival were laid, not in the light of the Renaissance, but in the heart of what we call the Dark Ages. There are also the early advances in science and engineering, often overlooked in traditional narratives, that happened during this so-called dark time. The development of the heavy plow, for instance, revolutionized agriculture, allowing Europe to support larger populations and paving the way for the population booms that would come in the following centuries. Similarly, innovations like the watermill and the windmill were refined and expanded during this period, helping to increase productivity in ways that allowed for the growth of early cities and trade networks. But even beyond these achievements, questions linger. Why do we still call it the Dark Ages? Was it really a time of ignorance, or was it simply different from the classical world that preceded it? The assumption of ignorance may be a product of our modern bias. After all, we are accustomed to thinking of intellectual progress in terms of the modern world's rapid advances. When we look back to the Dark Ages, we see a period that was slow, fragmented, and not always focused on the same ideals that drive modern science and philosophy. Yet, this does not necessarily mean that people during this time were ignorant. In fact, their worldview was shaped by different priorities, different understandings of knowledge, and a different approach to the world. The idea that this period was universally dark also ignores the rich intellectual and cultural life that flourished in the Byzantine Empire. While Western Europe struggled with invasions, feudalism, and the collapse of centralized authority, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, continued to preserve and expand upon the classical knowledge of the Greeks and Romans. The works of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy were studied and commented upon by Byzantine scholars, and the intellectual life of the empire was vibrant and ongoing. The rise of Islam in the 7th century further complicated the narrative. In the Middle East, scholars in places like Baghdad and Cordoba were translating ancient Greek texts, preserving and enhancing them with their own innovations in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Yet the prevailing narrative of the Dark Ages often paints the entire period with a broad brush of stagnation. But could it be that the term itself is a misnomer, created by later historians, in the Renaissance or even during the Enlightenment, to portray a period that was, in many ways, the antithesis of their own intellectual flourishing? When we begin to question this label, we start to see that what we call the Dark Ages may have been a time of quiet innovation, preservation, and intellectual ferment, even if it was not marked by the rapid advancements we associate with later periods of history. Perhaps the mystery lies not in the supposed ignorance of the time, but in the way we perceive it. How much of what we consider dark is simply a projection of our own biases and assumptions? Did the medieval world really live in the intellectual shadow of antiquity? Or did it have its own form of knowledge and understanding, one that simply did not fit the mold of classical thought? How much of what we think we know about the Dark Ages is shaped by the ideas of later generations who were seeking to define themselves in contrast to what came before? As we look deeper into the remnants of this forgotten era, through the ancient manuscripts, the preserved buildings, the tools and technologies, we are faced with more questions than answers. What really happened during these centuries that we call dark? What knowledge was lost? What knowledge was preserved? And what knowledge was simply ahead of its time? The truth of the Dark Ages remains shrouded in layers of misconception and bias. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all is the one we still face. How much of history has been misinterpreted by the lens through which we view it, and how much more of the past remains hidden in the shadows of time? The narrow streets of Florence, winding and sun-dappled, hold whispers of power, betrayal, and intrigue. Stone facades, centuries old, still bear the marks of a city that was once the heartbeat of Renaissance Italy, a place where art and intellect thrived, but where political life was a maze of conspiracies and hidden agendas. In the shadow of the Palazzo Vecchio, a quiet study may have once held a man whose name has become synonymous with cunning and moral ambiguity, Niccolo Machiavelli. His reputation has echoed through history as a master of manipulation, a promoter of ruthless strategies, and a guide to political evil itself. The very mention of his name conjures images of tyranny, deceit, and the amoral pursuit of power. Yet, like so many historical legends, the story may be far more complex than the caricature suggests. We often hear that Machiavelli wrote The Prince as a manual for tyrants, a blueprint for committing evil for its own sake. The text, published posthumously in 1532, is cited as proof that he advocated cruelty, deceit, and the ruthless exercise of power without moral consideration. To many readers, he seems a man who detached politics entirely from ethics, elevating pragmatism and opportunism above justice and virtue. The word Machiavellian itself has become shorthand for calculated immorality. But was this truly his intention, or is it the shadow of interpretation that has clung to his work for centuries? To understand the question, we must first return to the Florence in which Machiavelli lived. The city was a cauldron of instability, caught between the ambitions of powerful families, the shifting influence of the papacy, and the pressures of foreign powers like France and the Holy Roman Empire. Machiavelli himself served as a diplomat and civil servant for the Florentine Republic, witnessing firsthand the fragility of political alliances and the perils of weak leadership. In this context, the stark realism of The Prince begins to take on a different hue. It may not have been a celebration of cruelty, but a pragmatic analysis of how rulers survive in a world where ideals are often irrelevant to survival. Consider the text itself. Machiavelli frequently warns against unnecessary cruelty, noting that it should be swift and decisive when employed, and always balanced with the need to maintain order. He advises rulers to appear virtuous, even if they cannot always act virtuously. He describes fortune and circumstance as forces beyond one's control, shaping outcomes in ways that morality alone cannot. The work is analytical, observational, even cautionary. It is a guide for navigating chaos, not necessarily a manifesto of evil. Yet the perception of Machiavelli as a promoter of immorality took root almost immediately. His contemporaries and later thinkers were unsettled by his frankness. Renaissance political writing had traditionally couched counsel in moral or religious frameworks. To speak plainly about the necessity of power, even when it conflicts with virtue, was radical. Critics accused him of cynicism, claiming that he detached politics from ethics entirely. Over time, this image hardened, and Machiavelli became a symbol of cunning and amorality in political thought, a figure often feared, seldom understood. There is also the question of intent. Machiavelli wrote The Prince after the fall of the Florentine Republic, a time when he had been exiled and stripped of political influence. Some historians argue that the text was not meant as a celebration of tyranny, but as an appeal for restoration, a way to demonstrate his insight and usefulness to Lorenzo de' Medici. If this is true, then The Prince could be read as a deeply personal work, shaped by desperation, observation, and pragmatism, rather than a deliberate effort to glorify evil. Beyond the mainstream interpretations, speculative theories add further complexity. Some scholars suggest that Machiavelli's work was deliberately ironic, a subtle critique of autocratic rulers disguised as a guide to power. Others argue that his deeper political philosophy emphasized republicanism, civic virtue, and the importance of institutions, ideas that are often overshadowed by the sensational focus on the ruthless advice in The Prince. In this reading, the reputation of Machiavelli as a promoter of cruelty becomes almost a historical accident, the result of selective emphasis and misinterpretation over centuries. Even the broader cultural forces of the time shape our perception. Florence was a city of stark contrasts: wealth and poverty, loyalty and betrayal, patronage and political violence. Violence, espionage, and intrigue were not theoretical. They were lived experience. In this context, Machiavelli's counsel may reflect not the advocacy of evil, but the articulation of survival strategies for a city and a man caught in the currents of history. To understand his work purely as a manual for cruelty is to overlook the nuanced observation of human behavior that underpins it. We also cannot ignore the power of narrative over time. Machiavelli's name has been invoked in political discourse for centuries, often detached from the original context. Monarchs, diplomats, and critics alike have used Machiavellian as a shorthand for cunning and immorality, transforming a complex thinker into a caricature. This reputation, repeated in textbooks, popular culture, and political commentary, has shaped the way generations perceive him. The very myth of Machiavelli has taken on a life of its own, sometimes obscuring the truth beneath layers of interpretation and exaggeration. Standing in Florence today, walking past the same streets that Machiavelli once traversed, the questions persist. Did he truly promote evil for its own sake? Or was he merely describing the harsh realities of political life in a volatile age? Was The Prince a guide for tyrants, or a subtle argument for stability, prudence, and survival in a world where morality alone could not protect a state from collapse? And if the image of Machiavelli as an amoral strategist is a product of centuries of storytelling, how many other historical figures have been similarly miscast, reduced to legends that bear little resemblance to their true complexity? Perhaps the most chilling thought of all is not that Machiavelli advocated cruelty, but that history has the power to transform nuance into myth, subtle observation into fear. The man himself, once a keen observer of human nature, now exists largely in the shadow of his reputation, a symbol whose story has grown darker with each retelling. And as we continue to examine the layers of history, we are left with a quiet, unsettling question. How many truths have been lost, not to time, but to the stories we choose to believe? The fog lingers over the shores of Scandinavia, curling around jagged cliffs and vast windswept fjords. The sea crashes against the rocks with a rhythm as old as time itself, the sound of water meeting stone echoing through the ages. It is in this stark, unforgiving landscape that the Vikings once forged their legendary path, a people whose name has come to symbolize brutality, chaos, and bloodlust. From the beaches of England to the distant lands of North America, the Viking Age is often remembered for its ruthless raiders, whose longships struck terror into the hearts of the people they encountered. But is this the true story of the Vikings? Or have we been sold a version of history that simplifies and distorts the complexities of their world? When we think of Vikings, what comes to mind? Ferocious warriors with axes raised, pillaging monasteries and villages, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. The image is vivid, etched in popular culture, in Hollywood films, in novels and cartoons. But just like the myths surrounding any powerful figure or group, the Viking narrative has been shaped, warped, and exaggerated over the centuries. In truth, the Vikings were far more than just brutal raiders. They were also explorers, traders, settlers, and craftsmen who built a world spanning continents. The Viking Age, from the late 8th century to the 11th century, was a time of great expansion, but it was also a period of profound cultural and social change. Their raids certainly were a significant part of this era, but they were not the whole story. The Vikings were complex individuals with intricate beliefs, a sophisticated legal system, and a rich tradition of storytelling and art. Yet these aspects of their society have often been overshadowed by their image as violent invaders. What does this say about the way we view history, and how much of their true legacy is still hidden beneath the surface? The famous Viking raids began with the attack on the Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 AD, an event that is often cited as the starting point of the Viking Age. From this moment, the Vikings earned a reputation for terrorizing Christian Europe, striking fear into the hearts of the population. Their swift, brutal attacks, often on religious sites that were perceived as weak and unprotected, seemed to reinforce the image of a violent people driven by a lust for gold and conquest. However, this view of Vikings as nothing more than raiders is both limited and misleading. Consider, for example, the Vikings' seafaring skills. Their longships, technologically advanced for the time, allowed them to travel vast distances across the open ocean, far beyond their initial raids. These ships were not just instruments of destruction, they were vessels of exploration. The Vikings did not simply stop at the shores of England or France. They ventured into the heart of Eastern Europe, navigating the rivers of modern-day Russia, and they reached the Byzantine Empire, where they served as mercenaries in the Varangian Guard. The Norsemen even sailed to North America long before Columbus, establishing settlements in what is now Newfoundland, Canada. The question arises, if these people were simply raiders, how did they manage to build such a vast network of trade routes and colonies, stretching across continents? Their empire, often referred to as the Viking world, was a complex web of interconnected societies, from the icy shores of Greenland to the bustling markets of Baghdad. It was a world built not just on war, but on commerce and diplomacy. The Vikings were traders too, merchants dealing in fur, timber, iron, and slaves, exchanging goods with the distant lands they encountered. In fact, many of the riches they accumulated came from trade, not just raiding. Moreover, the Vikings were also skilled craftsmen, renowned for their shipbuilding, metalworking, and artistry. The intricate designs carved into their ships and weapons were not merely for decoration. They were expressions of their identity, their values, and their connection to the gods and the natural world. The Viking Age produced remarkable works of art, such as the Oseberg ship, a burial ship unearthed in Norway, which is considered one of the finest examples of Viking craftsmanship. This ship, along with others found in Viking burial sites, tells a different story from the one of simple brutality. These were people who valued beauty and skill, who believed in the power of ritual and ceremony. Yet, even in light of these achievements, the image of the Vikings as bloodthirsty warriors continues to dominate the historical narrative. Why is it that we have come to view them so narrowly? One possible explanation is the nature of the sources we rely on. Much of what we know about the Vikings comes from the accounts of those who were their enemies, monks and chroniclers from the lands they raided, such as Anglo-Saxon England, Ireland, and the Frankish Empire. These accounts were written by people who had witnessed the violence of Viking raids, and they naturally focused on the destructive aspects of Viking society. However, these writings often fail to capture the full complexity of Viking culture. The sagas, the epic stories of Viking heroes and gods, paint a very different picture. These were not tales of senseless violence, but of complex, multi-dimensional characters grappling with honor, loyalty, and fate. The sagas explore themes of kinship, leadership, and the eternal struggle between chaos and order. They are stories of a people whose actions were shaped by their beliefs and worldview, not just a desire for plunder. One of the most intriguing aspects of Viking society is their legal and political structure. The Vikings were not just a collection of raiders. They had a highly organized social order. The Thing, a council or assembly of free men, was the backbone of Viking governance. It was here that disputes were settled, laws were made, and leaders were chosen. The Vikings had a strong sense of justice, and their legal system was sophisticated for its time. This is hardly the picture of a chaotic, lawless people driven solely by the desire for destruction. What then are we to make of the Viking legacy? How much of the history we know is based on myths and misunderstandings? Were the Vikings truly just brutal raiders? Or were they a people whose complexities and achievements have been lost to time and oversimplification? As we dig deeper into the past, we must ask, what more lies beneath the surface of this misunderstood era? How much of the true Viking story has been overshadowed by the image of the bloodthirsty warrior, and what might we discover if we look beyond the raiding to the exploring, the trading, and the culture that defined their world? The Viking Age, like any period in history, was multifaceted, and the story of the Vikings may not be as simple as the one we've been told. Perhaps, as we peel back the layers of history, we will find that the true nature of the Vikings is far more nuanced and far more fascinating than we ever imagined. What else have we misunderstood about their world? What other truths remain hidden in the mist? The sun casts a golden glow over the ruins of Alexandria, once the jewel of the ancient Mediterranean. The great library, a beacon of knowledge, is long gone, but the city still stands, a monument to the past, its streets still murmuring the stories of the powerful and the legendary. And among the legends of this great city, one name echoes above all others: Cleopatra. Her image has been immortalized in countless works of art, her life woven into the fabric of history, drama, and myth. Yet, as we gaze into the depths of her legacy, a question lingers. Who was Cleopatra really? And where does the line between legend and truth blur? The popular image of Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen, is deeply ingrained in our collective consciousness. She is often depicted as a seductress, a mysterious woman who captivated Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, using her beauty and charm to manipulate the powerful men of Rome. This image of her, a woman of exotic allure and dangerous intelligence, has been romanticized for centuries. And yet, beneath this familiar story lies a truth that is far more complex than the version we've been taught. For all the pageantry and myth, Cleopatra was not Egyptian. This fact, though it may surprise many, challenges everything we thought we knew about her. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was born in 69 BC. Her family, the Ptolemies, were Greek in origin, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy I Soter, who took control of Egypt after Alexander's death. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and while they adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture, emphasizing the divine status of the pharaohs, for example, they remained very much Greek in identity. Cleopatra herself, despite her reign in Egypt, was of Greek descent, and her family had been in Egypt for over 200 years. In fact, Cleopatra's lineage was so distinctly Greek that she was one of the very few Ptolemies who actually spoke the Egyptian language. Most of her ancestors, including her father, Ptolemy XII, had never bothered to learn it. Cleopatra, however, understood the importance of connecting with her subjects, and she learned Egyptian to better communicate with the people. This detail, while significant in its own right, is often overshadowed by the more glamorous depictions of her relationship with Rome and her political maneuvering. The blending of Greek and Egyptian influences in Cleopatra's court was nothing short of fascinating. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to adopt Egyptian customs fully, presenting herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis and embracing the role of a pharaoh. In Egyptian eyes, she was a divine monarch, a link to the gods. In Rome, however, her identity was very different. She was a political player in the cutthroat world of Roman power, Not just the Queen of Egypt, but a figure entangled in the webs of Roman politics and military conquest. Her life, therefore, was a series of dual identities, Greek and Egyptian, foreign and familiar, divine and political. Why then has Cleopatra been remembered as a purely Egyptian figure? Why do we so often associate her with the land of the pyramids, when her Greek heritage was a central part of who she was? The answer lies in the narrative we've constructed around her. The Roman authors who chronicled her life, such as Plutarch and Dio Cassius, were keen to emphasize her exoticism, her difference from the Roman world. Cleopatra's seduction of powerful Roman men played into a narrative of the East as a place of decadence and danger, a place where beauty and power could intertwine in ways that were threatening to the Roman order. In this sense, Cleopatra's Egyptian identity was exaggerated and emphasized to feed into the cultural fears of the time. But there's more to the story. The image of Cleopatra as the quintessential Egyptian queen also ties into the way the West has viewed Egypt throughout history. Egypt, with its ancient civilization, its mysterious pyramids, and its association with the divine, has long been a symbol of the exotic and the unknown. In the popular imagination, Cleopatra became the ultimate embodiment of that mystery. It's almost as though her real identity, Greek, political, dynastic, was submerged under the weight of the mythic figure that we continue to revere. Even the monuments we associate with Cleopatra's reign often blur the line between fact and fiction. In Alexandria, Cleopatra is said to have commissioned a number of building projects, including a new temple to the goddess Isis, reinforcing her connection to Egyptian religious life. But the temples, the statues, and the public images she created were part of a deliberate political strategy. They were meant to show the people that Cleopatra was not just a foreign queen, but a legitimate ruler who understood and embraced Egypt's ancient traditions. The salt-scented winds of the Atlantic swirl through the air, carrying with them the whispers of journeys long past. Far out, where the vast ocean stretches infinitely toward the horizon, a solitary ship cuts through the waters, its sails billowing against the backdrop of a setting sun. The year is 1492, and on that ship is a man whose name has become synonymous with the discovery of a new world. Christopher Columbus. But did Columbus truly discover America? The truth is far more complex than the story we've been told. The tale of Columbus's first voyage, the one that took him from Spain to what we now call the New World, is one of the most familiar in history. Columbus, an ambitious Genoese navigator, set sail across the uncharted expanse of the Atlantic, driven by the belief that he could reach Asia by sailing west. Instead, he arrived in the Caribbean, landing on an island he named San Salvador, and his journey became the catalyst for an age of exploration and colonization that would forever alter the course of history. The story seems simple enough. A brave man venturing into the unknown, discovering new lands, and paving the way for a new era of European dominance. It's a narrative we've been taught for centuries, one that has become ingrained in the very fabric of Western history. But if we look a little closer, questions begin to emerge. Was Columbus really the first to discover America? Was his discovery as groundbreaking as we've been led to believe? Let's first consider the land Columbus arrived upon. While he certainly made contact with the Caribbean islands, what many overlook is that people had been living on these shores for thousands of years before his arrival. The indigenous populations, such as the Taino, the Arawak, and the Carib, had developed their own civilizations, cultures, and trade networks long before Columbus set foot on their land. They had already discovered America, and their ancestors had been navigating the waters of the Caribbean and beyond for millennia. So, how can we say that Columbus discovered a land that was already inhabited, already known to the people who lived there? But perhaps it is not Columbus's arrival that is the mystery. Perhaps the mystery lies in why his voyage is so often depicted as the discovery of America, when, in fact, others had reached these shores before him. The Vikings, for instance, are believed to have landed in North America nearly 500 years prior to Columbus's journey. Norse sagas tell of the Viking explorer Leif Erikson, who established a settlement in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, around the year 1000 AD. Archaeological evidence, such as the remains of a Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows, supports the claim that the Vikings were the first Europeans to make contact with North America. Yet their story was largely forgotten until relatively recently, overshadowed by Columbus's later and far more famous voyage. Even more curious is the idea that Columbus's journey was not an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern of exploration by European powers seeking new trade routes and territories. Columbus's voyages were fueled by the same thirst for knowledge, power, and wealth that had driven explorers like Marco Polo and Vasco da Gama before him. The age of exploration was not just a singular event, but a period of intense competition and ambition, where many nations sought to chart new lands and secure valuable resources. Columbus, in many ways, was a product of this age, not its sole initiator. But there is another layer to the mystery of Columbus's so-called discovery. As we examine his motivations, we begin to see that his voyage was not just about exploration, it was deeply political. Columbus was not simply seeking to expand geographical knowledge. He was also seeking to expand Spain's influence, wealth, and power. In a time when European monarchies were competing for dominance, Columbus's mission was framed as a bold effort to secure a new trade route to the east. It was only by accident, by miscalculating the size of the Earth and the distance to Asia, that Columbus stumbled upon the Americas. His discovery, in many ways, was the result of a misstep, not a triumph of precise navigation. The salt-scented winds of the Atlantic swirl through the air, carrying with them the whispers of journeys long past. Far out, where the vast ocean stretches infinitely toward the horizon, a solitary ship cuts through the waters, its sails billowing against the backdrop of a setting sun. The year is 1492, and on that ship is a man whose name has become synonymous with the discovery of a new world. Christopher Columbus. But did Columbus truly discover America? The truth is far more complex than the story we've been told. The tale of Columbus's first voyage, the one that took him from Spain to what we now call the New World, is one of the most familiar in history. Columbus, an ambitious Genoese navigator, set sail across the uncharted expanse of the Atlantic, driven by the belief that he could reach Asia by sailing west. Instead, he arrived in the Caribbean, landing on an island he named San Salvador, and his journey became the catalyst for an age of exploration and colonization that would forever alter the course of history. The story seems simple enough. A brave man venturing into the unknown, discovering new lands, and paving the way for a new era of European dominance. It's a narrative we've been taught for centuries, one that has become ingrained in the very fabric of Western history. But if we look a little closer, questions begin to emerge. Was Columbus really the first to discover America? Was his discovery as groundbreaking as we've been led to believe? Let's first consider the land Columbus arrived upon. While he certainly made contact with the Caribbean islands, what many overlook is that people had been living on these shores for thousands of years before his arrival. The indigenous populations, such as the Taino, the Arawak, and the Carib, had developed their own civilizations, cultures, and trade networks long before Columbus set foot on their land. They had already discovered America, and their ancestors had been navigating the waters of the Caribbean and beyond for millennia. So, how can we say that Columbus discovered a land that was already inhabited, already known to the people who lived there? But perhaps it is not Columbus's arrival that is the mystery. Perhaps the mystery lies in why his voyage is so often depicted as the discovery of America, when, in fact, others had reached these shores before him. The Vikings, for instance, are believed to have landed in North America nearly 500 years prior to Columbus's journey. Norse sagas tell of the Viking explorer Leif Erikson, who established a settlement in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, around the year 1000 AD. Archaeological evidence, such as the remains of a Norse settlement at Lonzo Meadows, supports the claim that the Vikings were the first Europeans to make contact with North America. Yet their story was largely forgotten until relatively recently, overshadowed by Columbus's later and far more famous voyage. Even more curious is the idea that Columbus's journey was not an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern of exploration by European powers seeking new trade routes and territories. Columbus's voyages were fueled by the same thirst for knowledge, power, and wealth that had driven explorers like Marco Polo and Vasco da Gama before him. The age of exploration was not just a singular event, but a period of intense competition and ambition, where many nations sought to chart new lands and secure valuable resources. Columbus, in many ways, was a product of this age, not its sole initiator. But there is another layer to the mystery of Columbus's so-called discovery. As we examine his motivations, we begin to see that his voyage was not just about exploration, it was deeply political. Columbus was not simply seeking to expand geographical knowledge, he was also seeking to expand Spain's influence, wealth, and power. In a time when European monarchies were competing for dominance, Columbus's mission was framed as a bold effort to secure a new trade route to the east. It was only by accident, by miscalculating the size of the Earth and the distance to Asia, that Columbus stumbled upon the Americas. His discovery, in many ways, was the result of a misstep, not a triumph of precise navigation. What's even more enigmatic is how Columbus's voyages were perceived in his own time. When Columbus returned to Spain after his first journey in 1493, he was hailed as a hero, a visionary who had uncovered a new world. But this view was not universally accepted, even within his own circle. Many of his contemporaries, particularly in the scientific community, doubted the significance of his discovery. Some questioned whether Columbus had actually reached Asia at all, suspecting that the lands he had encountered were part of an entirely unknown continent. Columbus himself, despite his later claims of having discovered a new world, never fully accepted that he had stumbled upon lands previously unknown to Europeans. His letters and reports, though glowing in their descriptions of the riches and potential of the New World, reflect his steadfast belief that he had found a western route to Asia. His discovery was, in his eyes, an unfortunate mistake that derailed his original mission. As Columbus's voyages gained prominence, so too did the mythology surrounding his achievements. Over time, his image as the discoverer of America became a cornerstone of Western historical narratives. But this narrative, too, is a creation of later historians. Historians who, through the lens of European triumphalism, shaped the story of Columbus's voyages into a symbol of conquest and exploration. The fact that the Americas were already inhabited by millions of indigenous people, the fact that other explorers had reached the continent before Columbus, became inconvenient truths that were buried beneath the grand narrative of European discovery. This historical narrative, built upon the myth of Columbus as the sole discoverer of America, continues to be perpetuated in schools, textbooks, and popular media. But in the light of the facts, of the indigenous populations, the Viking expeditions, and the complex web of motivations and misconceptions that defined Columbus's journey, it becomes clear that the story is far more complicated than we've been led to believe. Columbus did not discover America. He stumbled upon it, and in doing so, opened the door to an era of exploration, exploitation, and colonization that would forever change the course of history. So, why does this matter? Why should we question the long-held belief that Columbus was the first to discover America? Perhaps it is because understanding the true history of this momentous event requires us to reconsider how we view exploration, discovery, and the impact of European colonialism. The myth of Columbus's discovery serves to reinforce a narrative that minimizes the experiences of the people who had lived on these lands for thousands of years. It is a narrative that silences the stories of the indigenous peoples and glosses over the centuries of history that had already unfolded before Columbus ever set sail. And perhaps beneath all of this, there lies another mystery. What else have we misunderstood about the past? How many other discoveries are not as they seem, their true histories lost or obscured by time, myth, and cultural bias? Columbus's story, like many others, may not be as simple as it appears, and the deeper we dig, the more questions arise, suggesting that the past is far more layered and complex than the stories we've been told. The flickering light of a torch casts long shadows across the stone walls of a medieval castle. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and the heavy weight of history. Outside, the horizon is veiled by a gray fog that rolls in from the distant forests, where knights once rode in battle, their armor gleaming like a promise of honor and valor. These knights, so often portrayed as the epitome of chivalry and nobility, have been immortalized in songs, literature, and modern films. Their code, a moral ideal, insists on honor, courage, and loyalty, making them the symbol of a bygone era where the pursuit of justice was thought to be paramount. But what if this idealized vision of the knightly class, shaped over centuries, is not as clear-cut as we've been led to believe? To truly understand the nature of medieval knights, we must peel back the layers of legend that have obscured the reality of their lives. The romanticized image of the knight as a chivalrous figure, sworn to protect the weak and defend the honor of ladies, is a tale spun for centuries, passed down through generations as the standard by which all knights should be measured. Yet, when we examine the history of these warriors, the truth becomes far murkier. What we find beneath the shining armor is a complex, often brutal reality. The term knight evokes images of men in shining armor, mounted on horseback, charging into battle with sword in hand. We think of the Round Table and the gallant knights of Arthurian legend, or of the Crusades, where knights marched under the banners of Christian kings to free the Holy Land from the Saracens. These stories paint knights as paragons of virtue, dedicated to a strict moral code, one that demanded honesty, courtesy, and a sense of duty to the realm and to God. But these ideals, codified in the chivalric codes of the 12th and 13th centuries, were largely an invention of poets and scholars, a way to dignify the violent and often chaotic lives of the men who wielded power on horseback. The reality of knightly life was far less glamorous. The knight's primary role was, first and foremost, that of a soldier, and soldiers in the Middle Ages were not always the noble figures of romance and legend. War in the medieval world was brutal, with knights often fighting not for high ideals, but for personal gain, land, wealth, and influence. A knight's loyalty was often to his lord, not to an abstract code of honor. For many knights, the pursuit of glory and riches took precedence over chivalric duty. In fact, the very notion of knighthood was tied to the medieval system of feudalism, which was built on land ownership and the ability to raise armies. Knights were warriors in the service of powerful lords, and they were rewarded with land and privileges in exchange for military service. These men were not always born into noble bloodlines, and many came from common or merchant families. Over time, the title of knight became a means of social advancement, allowing those with the right connections and the financial means to purchase armor, land, and status. In many cases, the knight was not a noble born to privilege, but a social climber, willing to fight for his place in the world. It's important to understand that the feudal system itself was not designed to foster idealistic notions of heroism. Rather, It was a system of control, where power was concentrated in the hands of a few, and violence was often the most effective means of maintaining that control. A knight's service was a matter of survival, both for himself and for his family. Loyalty to his lord was paramount, and betrayal was a treacherous crime. But it wasn't just loyalty that defined these knights. It was the constant presence of violence in their lives. Battle, sieging, raiding. These were the ways in which knights earned their living. Consider the notorious raids on neighboring villages and towns where knights, acting under the authority of their lords, would pillage, burn, and terrorize civilian populations. The knights would not only take land, but would also loot and enslave the people they encountered. This was not the honorable defense of a kingdom, but the cold, strategic conquest of resources and wealth. Though some knights may have lived up to the ideals of chivalry in certain contexts, their actions in battle, where killing was part of the day-to-day reality, reveal a more complex and darker side to their character. Furthermore, the concept of chivalry itself, despite its idealistic presentation, was not universally adhered to. It was, in many ways, a code designed to reinforce the social structure of the time, ensuring that knights would act with deference to their superiors and maintain a level of decorum that was deemed appropriate for their elevated position. However, this was not always the case. Knights often engaged in brawls and petty disputes among themselves, and some even violated the very code they were meant to uphold, showing themselves to be corrupt, self-serving, and violent. The Crusades, in particular, offer a chilling glimpse into the complex nature of knighthood. The knights who fought in these religious wars, under the banner of Christianity, were not only motivated by religious fervor, but also by the promise of land, riches, and power. The conquest of Jerusalem and the other territories in the Holy Land was marked by brutality and violence on both sides, with knights massacring not only enemy soldiers but also civilians, Muslims, Jews, and even fellow Christians who stood in their way. The supposed chivalric code of protecting the weak and defending the oppressed was often abandoned when there was something to gain, revealing that the idea of knights as noble protectors was more often a convenient myth than a truth. And then there is the matter of women, the knight's supposed duty to protect and honor them. The ideal of the chivalrous knight who revered women was often used as a form of social control, enforcing traditional gender roles and expectations. The idea of courtly love, in which knights performed acts of valor to win the favor of a lady, was more about reinforcing societal norms than about genuine respect for women. It was an idealized version of knightly conduct, one that often had little bearing on the real treatment of women, who were frequently seen as property or pawns in the political games of noble families. As we delve deeper into the world of medieval knights, we begin to see the stark contrast between the idealized image and the grim reality of their lives. These were men who, while capable of great acts of heroism and bravery, were also deeply entrenched in a system that valued power and violence above all else. The chivalric code, with its lofty ideals, was often just that, an ideal, not a consistent practice. Many knights were more concerned with their own advancement, wealth, and power than with any noble quest for justice or honor. This contradiction, the knight as both hero and villain, raises a significant question. How much of the chivalric ideal was a product of later generations, seeking to romanticize and sanctify a violent, hierarchical society? And how much of the true nature of knighthood remains hidden beneath layers of myth, legend, and poetic embellishment? As we stand in the ruins of a medieval castle, with the wind howling through the broken walls, it is impossible not to wonder how much of the knightly code was about honor, and how much of it was simply a way to justify violence and power in an unforgiving world. The truth, it seems, lies somewhere in between the shining armor and the blood-stained swords, a reality far more complex and shadowed than the legends would have us believe. What other lies about this bygone era have been constructed for our comfort, and what truths still lie buried, waiting to be unearthed? Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast, rolling field, the horizon stretching endlessly before you, the curvature of the earth barely perceptible. The ground beneath your feet feels solid, unyielding, as if it were the very foundation of the world. But in the distant past, the world was not flat. Or was it? The question of whether people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat is one of the most enduring myths of history. For centuries, we've been taught that in the medieval period, people, especially scholars and intellectuals, thought the earth was flat, trapped in a time of ignorance and superstition. According to this popular narrative, it wasn't until the Age of Discovery and the work of explorers like Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan that we finally proved the earth was round. Yet, when we look closer, we find that this tale may be far more myth than reality, one that has been perpetuated through time, obscuring a much more nuanced understanding of medieval thought. Let's start with the geography of the Middle Ages. The people of this time were no strangers to the concept of a spherical earth. In fact, by the time the medieval period began, the knowledge of the earth's roundness had been well established by the ancient Greeks. As early as the 6th century BC, Greek philosophers like Pythagoras and Aristotle had theorized that the earth was spherical, and by the 3rd century BC, the Greek astronomer Eratosthenes had even calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy. The idea of a round earth was hardly a fringe theory in the ancient world, and this knowledge was preserved and further developed by Roman scholars. So, if the ancient Greeks and Romans knew the earth was round, why do we have this enduring myth that medieval people were ignorant of it? The answer lies in how history has been presented and interpreted over the centuries. During the Middle Ages, many people believed in a model of the universe that was heavily influenced by ancient Greek and Roman thought, as well as religious teachings. The roundness of the earth was not in dispute among educated people, including the clergy and scholars. In fact, by the 12th and 13th centuries, many universities across Europe taught that the earth was a sphere, and this knowledge was foundational to both astronomy and navigation. Medieval scholars like Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus wrote extensively on the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and other classical thinkers, all of whom supported the idea of a spherical earth. Moreover, the idea that medieval people were unaware of the earth's shape is a distortion that likely emerged much later. It wasn't until the 19th century, as the Age of Enlightenment gave way to a more secular, scientific worldview, that the myth of the flat earth gained traction. Some historians began to cast the Middle Ages as a dark age of ignorance and superstition, a time when religious dogma and a lack of scientific knowledge supposedly held back progress. This narrative, which painted the medieval period as a time of intellectual stagnation, needed a symbol of that ignorance. The idea of a flat earth became that symbol, an easy and misleading shorthand for the supposed backwardness of the time. But what about the belief in a flat earth among ordinary people? Here the picture becomes more complicated. While scholars may have known the earth was round, the everyday person living in medieval Europe might not have had the same access to education, and for many, the knowledge of the earth's shape would not have had the same significance in their lives. Theological teachings and religious texts, such as the Bible, did not emphasize the earth's spherical shape in ways that were critical to the common people. Instead, much of their worldview was shaped by Scripture, where the earth was depicted as a flat, immovable object. These religious depictions, alongside a lack of widespread access to books and education, likely led to the persistence of a flat earth conception among the general populace. But even here, things are not as simple as they may appear. The belief in a flat earth among the uneducated was not nearly as pervasive as we have been led to believe. In fact, the idea of a flat Earth was largely confined to ancient myths and certain religious interpretations. By the medieval period, most educated people had adopted a model of the Earth as a sphere, with a much more advanced understanding of its place in the universe. It wasn't that medieval people were ignorant of the Earth's shape. It's that the knowledge of it wasn't as widely spread among the lower classes, whose understanding of the world was often shaped by more immediate, practical concerns. Even more intriguing are the fringe theories that suggest there was more to medieval cosmology than simply the Earth's shape. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval thought was its blending of scientific knowledge with religious belief. While most scholars agreed that the Earth was spherical, they also believed in a geocentric model of the universe, where the Earth was the center of everything, and the stars and planets revolved around it. This belief was heavily influenced by the work of Ptolemy and other ancient astronomers, and it was an idea that persisted well into the Renaissance. But what if there were other, less mainstream beliefs circulating at the time? Beliefs that suggested alternative ways of understanding the world and the universe. Some historians and researchers have speculated that there were hidden or suppressed ideas during the medieval period, ideas that could have challenged the prevailing cosmological models. Could there have been small sects or intellectual circles who held different beliefs about the Earth and the universe, beliefs that were not recorded in the mainstream history we know today? There is, of course, no direct evidence to support these fringe theories, but the very possibility that knowledge could have been hidden or suppressed raises intriguing questions. After all, the history we know is often the result of what has been preserved, written, and recorded by those in power, often the church and the ruling classes. What ideas were discarded, marginalized, or even deliberately erased in favor of the dominant worldview? Could there be more to medieval cosmology than we've been taught? And then, there's the lingering question of how these ideas were communicated. Medieval people, especially the clergy and intellectuals, had access to intricate maps, charts, and astronomical texts, some of which depicted the Earth as a sphere. But how did this knowledge circulate? How did it reach the common people, who might have seen the world as flat and unchanging? And how much of what we know today about medieval thought comes from later interpretations and biases? As we look deeper into the myth of the medieval flat Earth, we must ask ourselves, how much of this story is simply a convenient narrative designed to make the Middle Ages appear more backward than they truly were? Was the belief in a flat Earth truly widespread, or was it just a myth invented by later historians to contrast the dark Middle Ages with the enlightened Renaissance? Could the reality have been more nuanced than we can imagine? Standing on the edge of history, gazing out at the horizon, we realize that the story of the flat Earth may be less about the shape of the planet and more about how history is told. The truth, like the curvature of the Earth itself, may not always be as clear as it seems. Perhaps, in the end, we are left to wonder, how many other myths about the past still remain, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to shift our understanding of what once was. From the vast emptiness of space, Earth looks like a smooth blue orb, marred only by wisps of cloud and the occasional storm. Yet, for centuries, it has been said that there is one man-made structure on the planet so immense that it is visible to the naked eye from space. The Great Wall of China, a sprawling serpentine monument that stretches more than 13,000 miles across the rugged terrain of northern China. It is a symbol of the country's history, strength, and resilience, an enduring testament to human ambition. For generations, this idea that the Great Wall of China is visible from space has been firmly entrenched in popular imagination. It is a claim so widely accepted that it has become a fixture in our understanding of both the wall and space exploration. The grandeur of the wall, spanning mountains and deserts, is so immense that it seems almost a given that it could be seen from the void of space. After all, it is the largest human-made structure in the world, built built over centuries by the hands of countless workers. It is as if the wall, with its staggering length and historical significance, were destined to be seen from the heavens. But what if this widely held belief is nothing more than a myth? What if, in the end, the truth is far more elusive than the popular narrative suggests? The Great Wall of China is undeniably impressive, an architectural marvel that snakes its way across some of the most challenging and picturesque landscapes in the world. Built, rebuilt, and extended over many dynasties, the wall was designed to defend against invaders, protect the Silk Road trade routes, and establish control over northern territories. In its original form, it was a series of fortifications, walls, watchtowers, and fortresses constructed from a range of materials, including stone, brick, wood, and earth. Over the centuries, the wall has been imprinted in the collective consciousness of humanity as both a military defense structure and a symbol of determination. Yet, the myth of its visibility from space has added an almost mystical aura to the wall, elevating its status beyond just a historic landmark. As if the wall, long thought to be the result of tremendous human effort and perseverance, deserves to be acknowledged by the very stars themselves. But does it? Is the wall truly visible from space, as the myth suggests? Or is this belief more a matter of perception than fact? At first glance, the idea that the Great Wall could be visible from the vastness of space seems plausible. It is, after all, the longest wall ever constructed by human hands. Stretching an astonishing 13,000 miles, it traverses some of the most remote and rugged terrain on Earth, from the mountains of the Gobi Desert to the rolling plains of northern China. The wall's sheer scale is impressive. The very thought of something so large and enduring, woven into the fabric of the Earth's surface, calls to mind the vastness of space itself. But the reality of seeing the Great Wall from space is far more complicated. In fact, it turns out that the wall is not easily visible from orbit, at least not with the naked eye. Astronauts who have been to space, including those aboard the International Space Station, have reported that they cannot see the wall without the aid of telescopic lenses. Even then, the wall is incredibly difficult to distinguish from the surrounding landscape. The wall is made from materials that blend with the environment, earth tones that are similar to the surrounding terrain, making it hard to pick out from the natural contours of the land. In fact, the myth of the wall's visibility from space can be traced back to a misunderstanding of what astronauts can actually see from orbit. The claim that the Great Wall is visible from space likely originated in the early days of space exploration, when people were eager to celebrate the achievement of space travel and wanted to believe that something as iconic as the wall could be seen from the stars. It is a powerful image, humanity's grandest structure reaching up to touch the heavens. But in reality, the wall is often too narrow and too similar in color to the surrounding landscape to be visible from space with the naked eye. Some have argued that the wall can be seen under certain conditions, perhaps when the lighting is just right or when the observer is in the right place at the right time. The wall is undeniably large, and its winding course across the land could, under optimal circumstances, be picked out by a trained observer with the right equipment. But for the vast majority of those in space, the wall remains largely invisible, lost in the immensity of the planet below. What, then, is the origin of this myth? Why has it persisted for so long, despite the evidence to the contrary? The answer, perhaps, lies in the power of storytelling and the human need to find meaning in the things we create. The Great Wall is one of the most iconic symbols of human achievement, and the idea that it is visible from space elevates it to something greater than mere architecture. It turns the wall into a symbol of humanity's connection to the cosmos, as if the wall, with its grandeur, can reach into the stars. It's a myth that taps into our desire for our greatest creations to be acknowledged by the universe itself. But myths, like walls, can often obscure the truth. The The Great Wall of China is undeniably an extraordinary feat of engineering, but the reality of its visibility from space is far more mundane. It's a lesson in how our perceptions of history, culture, and the natural world can be shaped by the stories we tell and the myths we create. The wall may not be visible from space, but it is no less remarkable for that. Its significance lies not in its ability to be seen from the heavens, but in its place in the history of human civilization. And yet, the mystery of why this myth persists is worth considering. Why do we cling to the idea of the wall's visibility from space? Is it because we are drawn to the idea of our achievements being recognized on a cosmic scale? Or does the myth offer us something deeper, a sense that the human endeavor, the effort to build, to create, and to protect, has the power to transcend time and space itself? Perhaps the true mystery is not whether the Great Wall is visible from space, but why we continue to embrace this myth, even when faced with evidence to the contrary. What does this enduring belief say about our relationship with history, with our achievements, and with the vastness of the universe? As we continue to explore the world, both on the ground and in the sky, we may find that the answers are not always as straightforward as they seem. The Great Wall of China may not be visible from space, but its legacy is undeniable. And perhaps, in the end, that is the more enduring truth. Yet, even without the ability to be seen from space, the Great Wall's legacy endures in a different, more profound way. It stands as a testament to the human spirit, an unwavering symbol of perseverance and ingenuity in the face of adversity. The wall was not built by any single person, but by generations of laborers, soldiers, and craftsmen, each contributing to the construction of a monumental structure that would serve as both defense and symbol of unity for an ancient civilization. This collective effort, spread over centuries, is perhaps what truly defines the wall, making it one of the most significant achievements in human history. Furthermore, the wall's impact on the cultural identity of China and the world cannot be overstated. While it may not be visible from space, it is undeniably etched into the collective memory of humanity. The wall serves as a symbol of the enduring strength of China, standing as a physical and ideological barrier between the Chinese people and invaders, as well as a marker of the country's historical development. To this day, the Great Wall is celebrated in countless ways, from poetry and literature to art and film, inspiring generations to come. In the end, the myth of the wall's visibility from space serves as a powerful reminder of how stories can shape our perception of the world. As humans, we have a natural tendency to infuse our most iconic achievements with grandeur, seeking to align them with the vastness of the universe itself. This yearning to make our creations part of the cosmos is both an expression of pride and an attempt to transcend our earthly limitations. But as we journey through the world and the stars, we must remember that the true value of any creation lies not in how it is perceived from afar, but in its enduring impact on those who encounter it. Perhaps, then, the greatest lesson we can learn from the myth of the Great Wall's visibility from space is that our achievements, no matter how grand, do not need to be validated by the heavens to be truly remarkable. It is the legacy we leave on earth, the stories we pass down, and the way our creations continue to inspire and shape future generations that truly define their worth. The Great Wall of China, in all its imposing glory, is a testament to this enduring truth. The Senate chamber in Rome was dimly lit, a flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of incense and tension, the smell of politics and power. It was the Ides of March, 44 BC, and in the heart of the Roman Republic, a man who had climbed from humble beginnings to the heights of absolute power was about to meet his end. Julius Caesar, once a general, a dictator, a symbol of Rome's might, was surrounded by his trusted allies. Men who had fought beside him, men who had shared in his victories, men who had swore loyalty to his rule. But now, the same men stood poised to bring him down. As Caesar entered the Senate chamber, he may have sensed the danger, though perhaps he did not know the full extent of it. The conspirators were already in position, their daggers hidden beneath their togas, their faces grim with resolve. The plot had been months in the making, but no one could have predicted how it would unfold. As the senators surrounded Caesar, the first blow came, quick, sharp, and brutal. But it was the second that would be immortalized, the second that has echoed through history. Et tu, Brute. These three words, spoken perhaps by Caesar as he looked into the eyes of Brutus, a man he had once trusted as a son, are some of the most famous in the annals of history. They have been passed down through generations, immortalized in literature, theater, and the collective imagination. The phrase has become synonymous with the ultimate betrayal, the point at which even the closest of allies turn on you, plunging the dagger of treason deep into your back. It is an iconic moment, one that has defined the narrative of Caesar's assassination for centuries. But what if this moment, so ingrained in our understanding of history, is not quite the way it actually happened? The words, et tu, Brute, have been immortalized by William Shakespeare in his 1599 play Julius Caesar, in which Caesar utters them in a dramatic scene as he faces Brutus in the Senate. Shakespeare, writing centuries after the fact, crafted a portrayal of Caesar's death that was designed to maximize the emotional impact of the scene. But what if Caesar's final words were not those of betrayal? What if et tu, Brute, the famous cry of shock and disbelief, was simply a literary invention, a dramatic flourish added by the playwright, rather than a historical reality? In fact, the ancient sources that chronicle Caesar's assassination are somewhat unclear on the matter. The most detailed accounts of Caesar's death come from the writings of Suetonius, Plutarch, and Dio Cassius, but none of them provide definitive proof that Caesar actually spoke those iconic words. According to Suetonius, Caesar said nothing as he was stabbed by the conspirators. In his Lives of the Caesars, Suetonius notes that Caesar's final words were, "You too, my child," or "What you too, Brutus?" a reaction that is far more subdued than the Shakespearean rendition. Other sources mention that Caesar, in his final moments, merely gasped or uttered something indistinguishable. Plutarch, in his Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, provides a different perspective, suggesting that Caesar simply fell silent upon seeing Brutus among the conspirators, overwhelmed by the gravity of the betrayal. He does not record any dramatic last words, only noting that Caesar's shock at Brutus's participation was profound. Dio Cassius, the Roman historian who also wrote about the event, similarly records that Caesar said nothing before his death, merely resigned to the reality of his fate. Why, then, has the phrase "et tu, Brute" become so ingrained in our cultural consciousness? How did these words, so powerful in their emotional weight, become the defining line of Caesar's final moments? The answer lies in the enduring power of storytelling and the way in which certain narratives take on a life of their own, molding the past into a more dramatic and poignant form. Shakespeare, as he often did, took creative liberties with historical events to heighten their emotional resonance. His portrayal of Caesar's death, with its tragic betrayal and the stirring final words, served not only to make the assassination more compelling for audiences, but also to explore themes of loyalty, ambition, and power. The play was written during a time of political tension in England, when the monarchy was being scrutinized and the fate of rulers was on the minds of many. Shakespeare's Caesar, betrayed by the closest of men, struck a chord with audiences, making the betrayal not just a historical event, but a timeless allegory about the fragility of power and trust. Yet, as powerful as Shakespeare's rendition is, we must ask ourselves, Is it a true reflection of what happened that day in the Senate chamber? What do we really know about Caesar's last moments, and how much of the story has been shaped by centuries of retelling? The mystery surrounding Caesar's death does not end with his last words. The motivations of the conspirators are equally enigmatic. While the ancient sources suggest that Brutus, the son of Caesar's lover, was driven by a desire to protect the Roman Republic and prevent Caesar from becoming a tyrant, some have speculated that Brutus's personal relationship with Caesar was more complex. Did Brutus truly believe in the ideals of the Republic? Or was his involvement in the plot driven by personal ambition or rivalry? And what of the other conspirators? Were they all equally committed to the cause, or were they driven by a mix of personal grievances, jealousy, and fear? Even the nature of Caesar's power and the reasons why so many men conspired to take it from him remains a matter of debate. Was Caesar's rule truly the end of the Republic, as many of his assassins believed, or was it simply a response to the fracturing political system of Rome? Some have argued that Caesar's reforms were necessary for the stability of Rome, and that his assassination was a tragic error in judgment, one that ultimately led to the downfall of the Republic and the rise of imperial rule. In the years following Caesar's death, the story of his assassination became an almost mythical event, a turning point in the history of Rome. It was no longer just a political murder. It became a symbol of the fragility of power and the high cost of betrayal. Over time, Caesar's death was shrouded in legend, with each retelling adding new layers of drama and intrigue. And yet, despite the centuries of myth and legend, the true story of Caesar's final moments remains hidden from view. We are left with only fragments of the past, unanswered questions and historical ambiguities that leave us to wonder what really happened that day in the Senate. Did Caesar utter the famous line of betrayal, or was his death a quieter affair, marked only by the shocked silence of the man who had once ruled Rome? As we reflect on Caesar's death, we are confronted not just with the facts of the past, but with the ways in which history is shaped by the stories we tell. In the end, perhaps it is not the specific words that matter, but the lasting impression they leave. The tale of Caesar's assassination, whether or not it includes the cry, "Et tu, Brute," endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature, our capacity for betrayal, the fragility of power, and the uncertainty of fate. The question remains, what other myths, what other historical moments have been shaped by the stories we tell ourselves? What lies, like the phrase, "Et tu, Brute," have seeped into the fabric of our collective memory, obscuring the true course of history? As we delve deeper into the motivations behind the conspirators' actions, we are faced with a broader question. Was Caesar truly a dictator in the sense that his killers believed, or was he a necessary leader in the turbulent times of Rome? The answer is complicated. On the one hand, Caesar's reforms and centralization of power did challenge the traditional structure of the Roman Republic, but on the other hand, his actions were born out of necessity, attempting to stabilize a fractured and crumbling state. His assassination, in many ways, accelerated the very forces it sought to suppress, leading to the rise of imperial rule, which many argue was a more tyrannical system than anything Caesar himself had envisioned. In the end, the myth of "Et tu, Brute" invites us to think critically about the nature of history and the stories we choose to tell. It's a reminder that history is not a static, unchanging entity, but a fluid narrative, influenced by the perspectives and emotions of those who retell it. Whether it's Caesar's final words or the motivations behind his assassination, the story of his death has been shaped by the stories we have chosen to believe. Perhaps, as we look back on history, we should consider not just the facts, but the myths, for they too tell us something profound about who we are and how we view the world. The palace at Versailles, with its gilded halls and lush gardens, stood as the epitome of power and excess. Every corner seemed to whisper the same message: opulence. The walls, adorned with mirrors and velvet, seemed to catch the light of 1,000 candles as it flickered across the grand chandeliers. Outside, the sprawling grounds stretched beyond the horizon, meticulously manicured and manicured with the precision of a world that believed it was untouchable. In this palace, Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, had lived for years, a symbol of royalty's indulgence and grandeur. It was here, in this very space, that the story of a woman, an icon of both luxury and tragedy, would be reduced to a single, scandalous line that still echoes across centuries. Let them eat cake. The phrase, widely attributed to Marie Antoinette, has been deeply ingrained in our cultural memory. It has become the ultimate symbol of royal ignorance and cruelty, supposedly uttered in response to the suffering of the French peasants during the height of the Revolution. The story goes that when informed that the poor could no longer afford bread, the queen, unfazed and detached from the lives of her people, callously replied that they should simply eat cake. The phrase is often cited as the moment that captured the disconnect between the monarchy and the masses, an epitaph for a regime that would soon be overthrown. But was it true? Was this the queen's response? A reflection of a monarch so out of touch that she could not even comprehend the dire circumstances facing her people? Or, as with so many historical legends, is this tale more myth than fact, constructed to fit a narrative, distorted by time and retelling? The origins of the phrase trace back to 18th century France, a country embroiled in political and social upheaval. The French Revolution was a time of incredible unrest, fueled by widespread poverty, hunger, and resentment towards a ruling class that seemed to be impervious to the suffering of the common people. Marie Antoinette, an Austrian archduchess by birth, had married King Louis XVI of France, becoming the queen of a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse. Her extravagant lifestyle, her penchant for lavish fashion, and her involvement in scandals did little to endear her to the French public, who were struggling to survive in a society rife with inequality. In the midst of all this, the phrase, "let them eat cake," emerged. But where did it come from? The first recorded instance of the phrase appears not in any document from the Queen herself, but in a book published in 1767, Confessions by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, a philosopher whose works helped shape revolutionary thought, recounts a story of an unnamed princess, widely assumed to be Marie Antoinette, who, upon hearing that the people could not afford bread, suggested they eat brioche, a luxurious type of cake. Rousseau wrote that this remark was made when the queen was still a young woman, and it was nothing more than a rumor, a piece of gossip passed through the royal court. It was an unverified tale, though one that began to gain traction over the years. But, as with all rumors, there are discrepancies. In Confessions, Rousseau never states outright that the queen said these words. He simply mentions it as something that was attributed to her. It was a story told by others, a claim that never found solid ground in any official records or accounts of her reign. The idea that Marie Antoinette actually uttered these words cannot be substantiated by contemporary sources. In fact, several of her biographers, both during and after her life, note that she was not the detached, uncaring figure that history has often painted her as. While her extravagant spending and lavish lifestyle were often criticized, it was not because she was unaware of her people's plight. In fact, some have argued that she was deeply aware of the suffering in France, though perhaps powerless to do anything about it. Marie Antoinette's reputation was shaped largely by political forces, as much as it was by her actions. As the revolution took hold and the monarchy became the symbol of everything that was wrong with France, it was convenient for revolutionary propagandists to cast the queen as an uncaring foreign figure. The myth of the queen saying, "let them eat cake," played into this narrative perfectly, providing a scapegoat for the suffering that was widespread at the time. In this sense, the phrase was not simply a reflection of one woman's actions. It became a weapon, a tool used by revolutionaries to rally the people against the monarchy. The Queen's actual words, or lack thereof, are far less dramatic than the story would suggest. Her true sentiments were often expressed in her correspondence and letters, which reflect a woman who was deeply concerned with the welfare of her country, though burdened by the political constraints that came with her position. In the final years of her life, as the revolution raged around her, Marie Antoinette was aware that her image had been manipulated, yet there was little she could do to change the public's perception. Even during her imprisonment in the Tower of Temple, the image of the extravagant queen who had led France into ruin persisted. She was portrayed as a frivolous, self-indulgent woman, indifferent to the suffering of her people, when in truth she had often been a pawn in a much larger game of power politics. The line, "Let them eat cake," fit into the narrative of the monarch's isolation and failure, painting her as the ultimate symbol of royal decadence. But where, then, does the phrase fit into the broader narrative of her life? If Marie Antoinette did not speak these infamous words, why have they persisted as the defining moment of her reign? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the historical accuracy of the phrase, but in its symbolism. In a world of absolute monarchy, where the king and queen were seen as divinely ordained rulers, it was not enough for the people to simply reject the system of government. They had to reject the monarchy itself, to cast its leaders as the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the world. The phrase, "let them eat cake," captured perfectly the popular image of the queen as a figure of excess and cruelty, completely disconnected from the real world. And yet, what if the phrase, in its most insidious form, was a creation of the revolution itself? What if it was the work of those who wished to paint Marie Antoinette as the villain of the revolution, a convenient figurehead for the fury of a nation? After all, the revolution needed a face to match the narrative it was constructing. A myth had to be created to explain the suffering of the French people and to fuel the fire of the revolutionaries' anger. Marie Antoinette, with her foreign birth, her extravagant spending, and her lavish lifestyle, made for the perfect target. In the end, what remains unclear is not just whether Marie Antoinette actually said the words, "let them eat cake," but what this myth reveals about how history is shaped. How often do we accept stories without questioning them, simply because they fit into a neat and satisfying narrative? The truth, it seems, is far murkier, and the legacy of Marie Antoinette, like so many historical figures, has been rewritten by the forces of politics and propaganda. So the question lingers, did she say it? The answer, in all likelihood, is no. But perhaps that is not the real mystery here. Perhaps the true question is, how many other myths and lies have been woven into the fabric of history, obscuring the truth of what really happened? And how much of history as we know it is nothing more than a carefully crafted story, shaped by the desires of those who wish to control the narrative? The creation of such myths is not unique to Marie Antoinette. It is a pattern that can be observed throughout history. Leaders and figures who challenge the status quo or symbolize an existing power structure often become the target of narrative manipulation. Whether it's the portrayal of Julius Caesar as a power-hungry tyrant, or the demonization of Marie Antoinette as the epitome of royal excess, history is full of examples where the stories of individuals are reshaped to serve the needs of those in power. This rewriting of history serves to consolidate political agendas, create heroes and villains, and justify actions that may otherwise be difficult to explain. In this context, the "let them eat cake" myth was not just about Marie Antoinette. It was about what the revolutionaries needed her to represent, an out-of-touch monarchy that had to be overthrown to make way for the new republic. It's crucial, then, to recognize that history is often written not by the victors, but by those who control the narrative. The revolutionaries, having toppled the old regime, had the power to shape the public's understanding of the past. This control over historical memory ensured that Marie Antoinette's legacy would forever be tainted by the myth of her callousness. The fact that we still cling to this story, despite evidence to the contrary, is a testament to the power of propaganda and the way in which myths can persist long after the truth has been forgotten. The real story of Marie Antoinette, one of a queen navigating a turbulent political landscape, becomes obscured by the false image of the frivolous monarch. It is a cautionary tale, reminding us to be skeptical of the stories we are told, especially when they serve the interests of those in power. The Great Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles gleams with golden opulence, reflecting the light of 1,000 candles, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Here, amid the grandeur and decadence of France's most famous royal residence, Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor of an empire that once stretched from Spain to Russia, began his rise to unparalleled power. Yet, despite his extraordinary accomplishments, his military genius, his reshaping of European borders, and his monumental legacy, one detail of his story has always stood out: his supposed shortness. The tale of Napoleon's height is not just a historical curiosity, it is a central element in the mythology that has surrounded him for centuries. For generations, we have been told that Napoleon Bonaparte was a man of small stature, often depicted as a diminutive figure in relation to his larger-than-life ambitions. The image of the little emperor persists even today, ingrained in popular culture and in our collective understanding of history. But is this image based on fact? Or is it just another of history's great fabrications? Was Napoleon truly short? Or is the story of his height just another distortion, a lie that we have accepted as truth? Napoleon's height has been the subject of intense debate since his death in 1821. Early French records listed his height at 5 feet 2 inches, which, when converted to the English system of measurement, would translate to just under 5 feet 6 inches, quite average for a man of his time. Yet, for nearly 2 centuries, the myth of Napoleon's smallness has persisted. How did a man who was likely of average height come to be universally recognized as short? And why has this false perception continued to shape the way we see him? One key to understanding this mystery lies in the cultural context of the time. Napoleon's height was first recorded in French measurements, which were longer than the English foot. This discrepancy, although trivial, was one of the factors that contributed to the perception that he was shorter than average. But this alone does not explain how the myth of Napoleon's shortness became so widely accepted. After all, many people of the time were aware of the differences in measurement systems, and a simple conversion should have been enough to clear up the confusion. Perhaps the myth was further reinforced by the political climate that followed Napoleon's downfall. After his defeat in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo and his subsequent exile to the remote island of St. Helena, Napoleon's image underwent a drastic transformation. Once viewed as a brilliant military leader, the Emperor of the French now became a symbol of the old regime, a figure to be vilified by the victors. His enemies, particularly the British and the Prussians, found it convenient to downplay his stature, not just physically but politically and symbolically as well. The more they could belittle Napoleon, the easier it became to cast him as a fallen hero, a leader whose rise to power was as absurd as his eventual downfall. In British political cartoons of the time, Napoleon was often portrayed as small, petty, and overambitious, his physical size matched by the exaggerated caricature of his personality. These depictions emphasized his shortness as a sign of his supposed inferiority and belied his remarkable ability to dominate European politics. One famous illustration shows him being confronted by a giant Britannia, towering over him, casting a long shadow. Such images became part of the growing narrative that Napoleon's ambitions were disproportionately grand in relation to his personal size. But was this simply propaganda designed to weaken Napoleon's image? Over time, the image of Napoleon as a short and insignificant figure began to take hold not just in cartoons, but in the broader cultural memory. In this way, the myth of his shortness became deeply intertwined with his personal narrative and his place in history. The emperor who sought to conquer Europe was now reduced to an image of physical smallness, a man whose ambition exceeded his height, both literally and figuratively. Napoleon's supposed shortness became a subject of fascination, not just among his contemporaries, but among generations of historians and biographers who have written about him. From the 19th century to the present, scholars have debated his true height, with some even speculating that his physical stature was diminished by the effects of his exile, illness, or the toll of his military campaigns. But the myth of Napoleon's height persists, fueled in part by the power of cultural memory and the enduring influence of the narratives we tell about the past. The reality of Napoleon's height is, as we now know, far less dramatic. His height, when measured using contemporary French records, would have been about 5 feet 6 inches, a perfectly average height for a man of the early 19th century. The reality of Napoleon's height is, as we now know, far less dramatic. His height, when measured using contemporary French records, would have been about 5 feet 6 inches, a perfectly average height for a man of the early 19th century. This was not the towering figure of myth that we are so accustomed to, but it was certainly not the short man of popular imagination either. However, if Napoleon's height was not as extraordinary as the legend suggests, then why has this lie endured for so long? Part of the answer lies in the psychological power of narratives and the human tendency to amplify details that fit within the stories we want to believe. For centuries, people have believed that Napoleon's stature was a defining characteristic of his personality, a symbol of his drive to compensate for perceived physical shortcomings by seeking dominance on the world stage. In many ways, Napoleon's supposed shortness served as a metaphor for the challenges he faced throughout his career. An outsider in France, an emperor who came from humble beginnings, a man who fought against the odds. The image of Napoleon as small and determined, relentless in his pursuit of power, fit perfectly within the narrative of his life and legacy. But the persistence of this myth raises other, more troubling questions. Why do we continue to accept historical myths, even when the evidence contradicts them? Why is it so tempting to hold on to narratives that simplify the past, that reduce complex figures to single, easy-to-digest qualities? Napoleon's shortness, like many other historical lies, serves as a convenient shorthand, a way to categorize a man whose life defies simple explanation. But in doing so, we overlook the complexities of his character and the true nature of his reign. The fact remains that Napoleon Bonaparte was a figure of extraordinary complexity. His rise to power, his military genius, and his political reforms left an indelible mark on Europe, one that reverberates even today. To reduce him to a caricature of a short man with a big ego does a disservice to both the man and his accomplishments. But as with so many myths, the enduring image of Napoleon as a small, ambitious leader is far more enduring than the facts themselves. In the end, Napoleon's true height may not matter as much as the mystery surrounding the story of his life. The myth of Napoleon's shortness continues to thrive because it resonates with a deeper, more universal human experience, the tendency to focus on the superficial and the symbolic rather than the complex and the nuanced. His legacy, like his height, has been shaped by history, manipulated by the stories we tell, and filtered through the lens of the victors. So, as we reflect on the image of Napoleon, the short emperor who sought to conquer the world, we are left with a question. How many other historical figures have been reduced to myths or legends that obscure the truth of who they were? And how many of the great stories of the past are built on false foundations, stories that continue to shape our understanding of history long after the real events have been forgotten? Furthermore, the myth of Napoleon's shortness highlights the human desire for easy explanations. Complex historical figures and events often beg for simplified versions that fit neatly into our understanding of the world. In Napoleon's case, the idea of a short, overcompensating emperor fits perfectly with our cultural narrative of the underdog rising to greatness. It's a story that resonates deeply because it frames Napoleon's ambition as something driven by insecurity. This metaphorical interpretation of his physical stature as a symbol of his psychological motivations makes his story more relatable, more comprehensible. But it also distorts the reality, reducing a monumental figure to a stereotype. Ultimately, the question of Napoleon's height becomes secondary to a larger issue: the role of myths in shaping history. The real story of Napoleon, his rise, his rule, his eventual downfall, is far more complicated and multifaceted than a simple tale of a short man with an oversized ego. By holding on to the myth of his shortness, we diminish the true complexity of his character and ignore the lessons of his reign. Napoleon's legacy was built not just on his physical presence, but on his intellectual acumen, his ability to inspire, and his far-reaching impact on the world. Yet, as with so many myths, the distortion of his figure has persisted, reminding us how easily history can be rewritten by the stories we choose to believe. The quiet, dusty halls of the Swiss Polytechnic in Zurich, nestled among the city's old stone buildings, echo with the footsteps of students eager to challenge the boundaries of knowledge. In the late 19th century, this institution would become the crucible for some of the most brilliant minds of the modern era. Yet, one name stands out above the rest, a figure whose work would revolutionize the very fabric of our understanding of space and time: Albert Einstein. Today, his name is synonymous with genius, with breakthroughs in physics, and with the concept of relativity itself. But there is a strange and enduring myth about him that persists in the public consciousness, one that links Einstein's early life with an academic failure. The tale that Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant minds in history, failed math. It's a story that has been repeated countless times, circulating in textbooks, documentaries, and casual conversation. We've all heard it at some point. The young Albert Einstein, the prodigious physicist, struggled with basic mathematics as a child. The story goes that despite his genius in science and philosophy, Einstein was unable to grasp the very subject that would later become essential to his groundbreaking work. Albert Einstein failed math. This phrase has become a symbol of the misunderstood genius, the idea that even the most gifted individuals might stumble in their early education before finding their way to greatness. But is this true? Did the man who would go on to develop the theory of relativity truly fail math as a young boy? Or is this yet another example of historical myth-making, a distortion of fact that, over time, has evolved into a widely accepted tale? To answer this question, we must first look back at Einstein's early years, to the small town of Ulm, in the kingdom of Württemberg, where he was born in 1879. Raised in a middle-class family, young Albert exhibited signs of his exceptional intellect from an early age. He was a curious and thoughtful child, more interested in solving puzzles and exploring the natural world than engaging in the playful activities of his peers. By the age of 12, Einstein had taught himself geometry and algebra, studying them independently from textbooks. Far from struggling with math, he was already well ahead of his classmates, displaying a natural affinity for the subject that would later inform his scientific breakthroughs. So, where does the myth of Einstein's academic failure come from? The story begins with a misunderstanding of his school years, particularly his time at the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich. As a young student, Einstein was indeed not an exemplary pupil in all subjects, Like many young minds, he was somewhat rebellious, and his dislike of the rigid, authoritarian teaching methods of the time led to friction with his teachers. He struggled particularly with the memorization-heavy curriculum and was not fond of rote learning. However, despite his discontent with the educational system, Einstein's performance in mathematics remained strong. He excelled in advanced mathematical concepts, even as he found the conventional approach to schooling stifling. The confusion around his supposed failure in math likely stems from his academic record in other areas, especially in subjects like languages and history, where his performance was less stellar. These subjects were often weighted more heavily in his final grades, and as a result, his overall academic performance suffered. It's important to note, however, that his grades were not a reflection of his mathematical abilities. On the contrary, by the time he was in his teens, Einstein had already mastered calculus, a subject that would later play a crucial role in his revolutionary theories. The myth that Einstein failed math likely emerged from the contrast between his early academic challenges and his later genius. After he left the Luitpold Gymnasium, Einstein went on to study at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, where he would eventually earn his diploma. However, his admission to the Polytechnic was not without its hurdles. His entrance exams were difficult, and although Einstein passed the math and science sections with ease, he failed the general knowledge and language portions of the exam. But even in this failure, there is a more complex truth. Einstein did not fail because he lacked intellectual ability. He failed because the exam was poorly designed to accommodate his strengths, and because at the time he had little interest in subjects that didn't challenge him intellectually. It is worth noting that Einstein's difficulty with the general knowledge sections of his entrance exam was not a reflection of his lack of intelligence, but rather a product of the strict academic system of the time. The rigid structure of standardized testing, focused more on memorization than critical thinking, could not accommodate Einstein's unconventional approach to learning. It is easy to see how, over time, this academic struggle could have been distorted into the tale of a young Einstein failing in math, even though his true passion was always in numbers and equations. What, then, are we to make of the myth? Why has this story endured, becoming so ingrained in the public consciousness? Perhaps it's because the idea of a genius struggling against the odds resonates deeply with us. The narrative of the underdog, the individual who defies the expectations placed upon them, is a powerful one. Einstein's story, his early difficulties in school, followed by his eventual triumph in the world of physics, fits neatly into this narrative. The myth that he failed math provides a sense of reassurance. Even the greatest minds can stumble, and perhaps failure is not the end, but the beginning of something much greater. Yet, there is another layer to this myth, one that speaks to the way we engage with history and the stories we choose to tell. The myth of Einstein's academic failure also serves as a way to simplify and humanize the figure of the genius. We are all familiar with the image of the tortured artist or the misunderstood inventor struggling to find their place in a world that cannot understand their brilliance. By emphasizing Einstein's early struggles, we create a more relatable, accessible figure, a man who, despite his extraordinary intellectual gifts, was still capable of failure and imperfection. The myth adds complexity to his story, blurring the line between myth and fact, and providing a more comforting and familiar narrative for those who seek to understand his greatness. But as we examine this myth more closely, we are left with a larger question. How many other stories, like this one, have been distorted or misunderstood over time? How many of the facts we hold about history have been shaped not by truth, but by the narratives we want to believe? In the case of Albert Einstein, the story of his supposed failure in math reveals the tendency to build legends around historical figures, often at the cost of accuracy. The truth of Einstein's academic career is more nuanced than the myth suggests. He was a brilliant student, even if he didn't conform to the expectations of his time. And his intellectual journey was shaped not by failure, but by a desire to challenge the conventional limits of human knowledge. As we reflect on this myth, we must ask ourselves how many other myths are woven into the fabric of history. How many legends are shaped by our own biases, desires, and cultural narratives? What other stories have been embellished, distorted, or outright fabricated in the pursuit of a more compelling narrative? And perhaps most intriguing of all, how many truths remain hidden, buried beneath the myths we continue to tell ourselves about the past? As with so much in history, the truth of Einstein's early academic struggles is not as simple as it seems. The story of his failure is, like so many others, a blend of fact and fiction, of reality and the stories we choose to believe. And so, as we consider the life of one of the greatest minds in history, we are left with a question that lingers in the air. How much of what we think we know about the past is simply another lie waiting to be uncovered? However, while myths like the one surrounding Einstein's math struggles may provide comfort, they also highlight a more troubling aspect of how we process history. They reveal a tendency to oversimplify and distort complex figures and events, creating heroes and villains out of the raw material of truth. In Einstein's case, the myth of his academic failure may be seen as an attempt to reconcile the idea of genius with the human experience of failure. But by perpetuating this myth, we risk missing out on a more nuanced understanding of his life and achievements. In reality, Einstein's success came not from overcoming failure, but from his relentless pursuit of questions that others weren't asking, his desire to challenge existing paradigms and to think beyond what was accepted. The myth that he failed in math overshadows the true nature of his genius, which was rooted in creativity, imagination, and an unyielding determination to push the boundaries of human knowledge. The walls of Mount Vernon, George Washington's grand estate along the banks of the Potomac River, stand tall and proud against the backdrop of Virginia's lush forests. Here, the father of the United States spent his final years, far from the battlefields and political strife that had marked his earlier life. The mansion, with its stately columns and wide verandas, is a testament to Washington's legacy as a leader, a general, and a statesman. Yet, amidst the refined elegance of his home lies one of the most enduring myths about his character, the belief that George Washington never told a lie. This myth has been passed down through generations, crystallized in the famous story from Washington's childhood. It is said that, when faced with the question of whether he chopped down a cherry tree, the young Washington admitted to the deed, saying, "I cannot tell a lie." This image of the young Washington as an embodiment of truth and integrity has become an iconic part of American folklore, reinforcing the belief that Washington was, in all things, steadfast and truthful. But is this belief truly grounded in fact? Was George Washington, the first president of the United States, as unblemished as the myth suggests? Or is the story of his unblemished honesty just another piece of the narrative created by those who sought to shape his image? What happens when we dig deeper into the life of the man who is often considered the paragon of virtue and examine the reality of his actions and decisions? Did George Washington really never lie, or is there more to his character than the legend allows us to see? To unravel this mystery, we must first return to the origins of the myth. The story of the cherry tree, which has been passed down as part of the Washington legacy, was not written by Washington himself, but was introduced by Parson Weems, a clergyman and biographer who sought to portray Washington as the ultimate role model for the nation. Weems wrote a biography of Washington in 1806, several years after the president's death, and it was in this book that the tale of the cherry tree was first introduced. Weems' intention was clear. He wanted to present Washington as an idealized figure, someone who was above reproach, a man whose character was beyond question. The story of the cherry tree fit perfectly into this image. a simple, almost parable-like tale that emphasized Washington's honesty and moral fortitude. But it was a story invented by Weems, not Washington himself. The legend, though untrue, became so deeply ingrained in American culture that it is still widely believed today. It is a symbol of the virtues that early Americans wanted to associate with their new nation: honesty, integrity, and a commitment to truth. The tale of Washington's refusal to lie was held up as an ideal that every citizen, especially leaders, should aspire to. But as we take a closer look at Washington's life, we begin to see a more complex figure, one who, while certainly a man of great moral character, was not without his own contradictions and political maneuvering. Washington's presidency, for instance, was not free of political deceit or calculated decisions that were, at times, less than transparent. While Washington was undeniably committed to the welfare of the new nation, he was also keenly aware of the need to maintain his own political power and the power of the office he held. His dealings with other countries, including the French and the British, were often marked by diplomatic maneuvering that was far from the simple, upright honesty depicted in the myth. Washington had to navigate the complex and often treacherous political landscape of a young nation, balancing competing interests and power struggles both at home and abroad. One of the most significant examples of Washington's political pragmatism, and perhaps a departure from the legend of his absolute honesty, came during his handling of the war debt in the early days of the United States. As president, Washington faced the challenge of securing the nation's financial future, while also keeping the fledgling republic's unity intact. To do so, he supported Alexander Hamilton's controversial financial plan, which included assuming the war debts of individual states. This decision was not purely about economic necessity. It was also a political calculation aimed at consolidating federal power and ensuring the loyalty of key states. Washington, who had been a champion of states' rights during the Revolution, was now, in some ways, bending his own principles to achieve a broader goal. This is not to say that Washington was unscrupulous or dishonorable in his actions. On the contrary, he was guided by a deep sense of duty to his country and a desire to create a stable government. But it would be misleading to say that he was always a man of perfect honesty, particularly when it came to the delicate art of political negotiation. Washington's own admission, in his farewell address, that he had errors of judgment during his presidency is a candid reflection of the complexity of his decisions. His commitment to truth did not prevent him from making choices that he believed were in the best interest of the nation, even if those choices required strategic concealments or compromises. Further, Washington's relationship with slavery presents another layer to this question of honesty. Despite his image as a leader of principle, Washington, like many of his contemporaries, was a slave owner. His management of his own slaves and his participation in the system of slavery complicate the idealized version of Washington as a man above reproach. In his will, Washington did arrange for the eventual emancipation of his slaves, but this was only after the death of his wife, Martha, and many of his slaves remained in bondage throughout his life. Was this a lie of omission, a failure to confront the moral contradictions of slavery during his lifetime? Or was it simply a reflection of the complex, deeply entrenched system that he inherited? This raises the question, when does honesty become a tool of political convenience, and how much of Washington's personal legacy has been shaped by the myths that surround him? The reality of Washington's life was far more nuanced than the one-dimensional figure of incorruptible virtue we've come to know. His political decisions, while motivated by a sense of duty to his country, were often steeped in the complexities and contradictions of the time. To claim that he never lied, at least in a broader, more figurative sense, is to oversimplify the nature of leadership itself. This doesn't diminish the importance of Washington's character or his contributions to the founding of the United States. On the contrary, His ability to lead through times of great uncertainty and strife speaks to a man of profound vision and strength. But the legend of his unblemished honesty overshadows the complexities of his life, obscuring the moral ambiguities that every leader must confront. In the quest for myth-making, Washington's human flaws have been minimized, and his very real struggles with leadership have been overlooked. As we examine the story of George Washington and the myth of his perfect honesty, we are confronted with a deeper, more unsettling question. How many of the great stories of history are built on idealized images, rather than the complicated truths of the individuals they represent? Washington's story is just one example of how history, and the myths we create, can obscure the complexities of the past. The myth of Washington's absolute honesty has persisted for over 2 centuries, but it is worth asking whether this version of him is truly reflective of the man who shaped the nation, or whether it is a carefully constructed narrative designed to simplify the realities of power, compromise, and leadership. In the end, we are left to wonder how many other figures from history have had their truths distorted, smoothed over, or entirely fabricated in the name of myth-building. What other historical figures, like Washington, have been turned into symbols of virtue and purity, their flaws buried beneath layers of legend? And perhaps most importantly, what truths still lie hidden beneath the myths, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to look beyond the stories we have been told? As we continue to explore the mysteries of history, we must keep in mind that even the most revered figures, those who have shaped nations and left indelible marks on the world, are not immune to the distortions of time. The myth of George Washington's unblemished honesty may be one of the most enduring, but it is far from the only one. And as we dig deeper into the past, we may uncover more of these myths, revealing a history far more complicated and far more human than we have been led to believe. The cold wind whistles through the towering peaks of the Scandinavian mountains, a barren landscape untouched by time. Beneath the ever-shifting skies, the remnants of long-abandoned Viking settlements lie scattered across the rocky terrain. The sagas of these fierce northern warriors, written down centuries after their reign, echo through history, filling our minds with images of brutal raiders, conquerors, and explorers. But in these tales, one image stands above all others: the horned helmet, a symbol of Viking ferocity and power. For centuries, this iconic image has been etched into our collective imagination by Hollywood, artwork, and mythology. The horned helmet is as synonymous with Viking culture as the longship and the berserkers. But did Vikings truly wear horned helmets, as so many depictions suggest? Or is this one of history's most enduring lies, a creation of myth rather than reality? To explore this mystery, we must first look at the origins of the horned helmet image. The connection between Vikings and horned helmets can be traced back to the 19th century. It was during this period, in the midst of Romanticism and the rise of nationalism, that the Vikings began to be reimagined as larger-than-life figures, embodying the ideals of strength, bravery, and raw power. This reimagining was heavily influenced by the works of artists and scholars who sought to glorify the Vikings and their legendary past. One of the key events that helped cement the association between Vikings and horned helmets was the 1870s production of Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen, an opera cycle that delved into Norse mythology. Wagner's depiction of the Norse gods, including the warrior figure of Wotan, was rich with imagery of horned helmets, portraying them as symbols of both divinity and warrior culture. These operatic portrayals, coupled with grand romanticized artwork, painted a picture of Vikings clad in ornate horned helmets, figures that were equal parts myth and reality. In fact, much of what we know about Viking helmets is based on this artistic tradition rather than historical evidence. The earliest depictions of Viking warriors, such as those found on rune stones or in medieval sagas, never show horned helmets. These representations tend to show helmets that are simple, practical, and unadorned, often made of iron or leather, designed to protect in battle. The horned helmet, it seems, was a creation of the 19th century, a projection of a romanticized vision rather than a reflection of historical accuracy. So where did the idea of horned helmets come from, and why has it persisted for so long? To understand this, we must turn to the world of archaeology and examine the physical evidence, or lack thereof. While numerous Viking helmets have been found in burial sites and archaeological digs, none of these helmets feature horns. The most famous Viking helmet discovery was made in 1943 in the burial mound of a Viking warrior in Norway. This helmet, made of iron, is a simple yet effective design, a rounded shape with a nose guard and no horns. There is no sign of elaborate decoration or fantastical elements, as we might expect if the horned helmet myth were grounded in reality. Even more striking, no historical records from the Viking Age mention horned helmets. The sagas, which chronicle the lives of Viking kings, warriors, and gods, describe helmets, but they do not suggest that the warriors wore horned versions. The myth, it seems, is a later invention, one that has taken on a life of its own, long after the last Viking raids had ended. Still, the image of the horned Viking helmet persists, and it is not without its appeal. It taps into something primal, something visceral. The idea of a warrior with horns, a figure that blurs the line between human and divine, between mortal and godlike, stirs something deep within us. Horned helmets were often associated with gods and deities in various mythologies, from the Greek god Pan to the Celtic and Norse pantheon. The symbolism of horns as a representation of power, fertility, and spiritual transcendence was not lost on artists and storytellers. And while the Viking Age itself may not have seen horned helmets in reality, the iconography that emerged in later centuries clearly drew on these ancient symbols. As Vikings began to be mythologized in the centuries after their raids, it became easy to project these divine associations onto their imagery. Horned helmets, with their powerful and otherworldly associations, were simply too compelling for artists and writers to resist. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the horned helmet myth is the way it continues to capture our collective imagination. Why does this image hold such a powerful grip on us? In part, it may be due to the fact that we still know so little about the Vikings. The historical record from the Viking Age is fragmentary at best, and much of what we think we know about them is colored by later interpretations. Their world, their beliefs, and their way of life remain shrouded in mystery, with only the faintest traces left behind. This has left room for speculation, for legend, and for myth to fill in the gaps. Vikings are often seen as the ultimate symbol of warrior culture, a people who lived on the edge of civilization, ruled by a harsh code of honor and strength. The horned helmet fits neatly into this narrative, adding an aura of mystery and grandeur to their image. It is easy to see why it has remained so persistent. But as we peel back the layers of myth, we begin to see that this image is not as grounded in reality as we might have believed. This raises an even deeper question. How many other elements of Viking culture, or any ancient civilization, are colored by myth rather than fact? What other seemingly undeniable truths have we accepted simply because they fit neatly into the narratives we have created? The idea of the horned Viking helmet is just one example of how history can be shaped by the stories we want to believe rather than the facts themselves. Could it be that the real Viking warriors were far more practical than we've imagined, not dressed in exaggerated, fantastical armor, but in simple gear designed for survival and battle? Perhaps this practical simplicity, which is often overshadowed by the dazzling image of horned helmets, speaks to something deeper about their culture. The true Viking warrior may have been more about survival, conquest, and exploration than the romanticized image we have come to know. So, as we consider the image of the horned helmet, we are left with lingering questions. What other symbols have been misinterpreted or exaggerated over time? How many of the myths we carry about the past are simply products of our imagination, woven into the fabric of history to suit our cultural ideals? And perhaps most importantly, what other stories from the Viking Age, stories of warriors, gods, and explorers, remain buried, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to question the myths we've been handed? In the end, the horned helmet may be one of the most enduring and yet least accurate symbols of Viking culture. But it serves as a reminder. History is often shaped not just by the facts, but by the stories we choose to tell. And as we continue to explore the past, we must be vigilant, questioning the narratives we inherit, and seeking the truths that lie beneath the surface. Because in the end, the most powerful myths are often those that are closest to reality, and those are the stories that are the hardest to see clearly. The enduring myth of the horned helmet also speaks to the larger human tendency to glorify and romanticize the past. Throughout history, societies have often embellished or distorted the traits of ancient peoples to reflect their own ideals and aspirations. In the case of the Vikings, the image of the horned helmet may have emerged during the 19th century, fueled by Romanticism and a growing fascination with Norse mythology and warrior culture. As Europe grappled with the Industrial Revolution and the loss of Old World values, the Viking became a symbol of strength, freedom, and defiance. The horned helmet, with its dramatic flair, fit perfectly into this narrative of rugged, untamed heroism. Yet, as we peel back the layers of this myth, we come to realize that such romanticized images often obscure the more complex and perhaps less glamorous realities of those ancient cultures. It is a reminder that history, like mythology, is often shaped by the present rather than the past, influenced by the stories we wish to tell rather than the truths we need to uncover.